true scary stories for sleep. Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. I never thought I'd encounter true fear until that night at the old lighthouse. The storm was raging, waves crashing against the rocks with a force that shook the very foundation of the tower. I was alone, or so I thought, keeping the light burning to guide ships away from danger. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, creating a haunting melody that seemed to echo from the depths of the sea. But it wasn't the storm that terrified me. It was the unexpected visitor who arrived just before midnight. He banged on the door with a force that nearly broke it down. A shipwrecked sailor, drenched and desperate, his eyes wild with fear. I let him in, offering shelter from the storm, but something about him was off. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, his words barely audible over the howling wind. As the night wore on, his demeanor shifted from grateful to something far more sinister. There was a chilling air about him that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sailor's story didn't add up. He claimed his ship had been lost to the storm, but there was no sign of wreckage, no distress signal. I began to wonder if he was really a sailor at all. The lighthouse, usually a place of solitude and peace, felt eerily oppressive with him inside. His eyes followed me as I moved about, never blinking, always watching. I tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to me like a second skin. As the hours ticked by, the storm outside grew fiercer, and so did the tension inside. The sailor started muttering to himself, pacing the floor with a manic energy that sent chills down my spine. He spoke of the sea as if it were a living, breathing entity. Something that had a mind of its own and a thirst for vengeance. I couldn't tell if he was mad or if there was some truth to his ramblings. But either way, I wanted him out of the lighthouse. Suddenly, the light at the top of the tower flickered and died. Panic surged through me as darkness enveloped us. The sailor's face twisted into a grotesque smile, and he whispered something that made my blood run cold. "It's coming for us." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't want to find out. I scrambled to relight the lamp, my hands shaking uncontrollably as the storm battered the lighthouse. In the dim light of my lantern, I saw him clearly for the first time. His clothes were tattered, but not by the sea. They looked as if they'd been shredded by something with claws. His skin was pallid, almost translucent, and his eyes, those eyes were filled with a darkness that seemed to swallow the light around them. It was then that I realized he wasn't a man at all. Something far more sinister. I tried to flee, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the storm had trapped us inside, sealing our fate together. The sailor, or whatever he was, began to laugh, a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. He spoke again, this time with a voice that was not his own. The sea always claims what is hers. At that moment, I knew I was in the presence of something beyond my understanding. The walls of the lighthouse groaned as if under immense pressure, and I felt a cold, damp breeze sweep through the room. The sailor, or the creature wearing his skin, advanced on me, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nowhere to go. The storm outside was nothing compared to the terror that stood before me. Just when I thought it was over, the lighthouse shuddered violently, and the light burst back to life. The creature recoiled, hissing like a wounded animal, and for a brief moment, I saw its true form, a mass of shadow and seaweed, with eyes that burned like coals. Screamed in agony as the light grew brighter, and with one final roar, vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the faint scent of salt and decay. The storm subsided soon after, as if whatever dark force had been at work was finally satisfied. I was left alone in the lighthouse, the silence more deafening than the storm had ever been. The sailor was gone, and with him, the oppressive weight that had filled the room. I don't know what I encountered that night, but one thing is certain. I'll never look at the sea the same way again. The haunting memory of that night still lingers, a chilling reminder that some forces are better left undisturbed. There's something about the open sea that always gave me a sense of freedom, but that day felt more like a vast, empty prison. I was out on my boat, fog rolling in thicker than I'd ever seen before. The horizon disappeared, and with it, any sense of direction. That's when I spotted it, a massive ship, drifting silently through the mist like a ghostly apparition. It looked abandoned, not a soul in sight, and my gut told me to steer clear. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached the ship cautiously, the eerie silence amplifying the creak of my boat against the waves. As I got closer, I noticed the ship's name, the Midnight Star, etched into the hull, though it looked worn and weathered, as if it had been at sea for decades. There were no signs of life, no movement, just the ominous groan of wood and the distant call of seabirds. The whole scene sent a chill down my spine, but I pressed on, eyeing my boat to the ladder hanging off the side. Climbing aboard, I was struck by how untouched everything seemed. Yet there was an air of abandonment that was impossible to ignore. The deck was covered in a fine layer of dust, and the sails hung limp in the still air. I called out, my voice echoing off the wooden walls. There was no answer, just the haunting silence of a ship that should have been bustling with life. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I made my way to the captain's quarters, the door creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was eerily preserved, as if the captain had just stepped out and might return any moment. A logbook lay open on the desk, pages yellowed with age. Flipped through it, the entries stopped abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. The last words were scrawled hastily, almost illegibly. Darkness, it's here. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Suddenly, I heard footsteps echoing down the hall, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to face the door, expecting to see the captain or one of the crew. But the hallway was empty, just shadows dancing in the flickering light. I told myself it was just the ship settling, but deep down, I knew better. Something was very wrong with the Midnight Star, and I was beginning to regret my decision to board it. I tried to leave, but the door to the captain's quarters wouldn't budge. It was as if the ship itself was holding me prisoner. Panic set in, and I threw my weight against the door, but it remained firmly shut. Then, I heard the footsteps again, this time accompanied by a low, menacing whisper that seemed to come from all around me. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was clear: anger, resentment, and something darker, something inhuman. Desperation took hold, and I scrambled to the window, hoping to find another way out. But when I looked outside, fog had thickened, completely engulfing the ship. There was no sign of my boat, no way to tell where the sea ended and the sky began. It was as if the Midnight Star had been swallowed by the mist, cut off from the world, and left to drift in an endless void. The reality of my situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I was trapped on a ghost ship, with no escape in sight. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as the shadows in the room seemed to close in on me. I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder, and I spun around. There was no one there. Fear gripped me like a vice, squeezing the air from my lungs. I had to get out. I had to find a way off this cursed ship, for whatever haunted it decided I was next. The shadows writhed, forming shapes that resembled twisted faces, their hollow eyes staring into my soul. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed the logbook and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered, letting in a rush of cold, salty air. I didn't think twice. I climbed out and onto the deck, my hands shaking as I looked for a way down. The mist was so thick that I could barely see a few feet ahead, but I knew I had to move fast. The ship groaned beneath my feet as if it were alive and aware of my every move. I found my boat miraculously still tied to the ladder, bobbing gently in the water below. I didn't waste any time. I slid down the ladder and jumped into the boat, untying it with trembling hands. As I rowed away, I glanced back at the Midnight Star. For a brief moment, I thought I saw figures standing on the deck, watching me with glowing eyes. But then, the ship disappeared into the mist, leaving me alone on the open sea, my heart pounding with the terror of what I had just escaped. There's something unsettling about driving through the mountains late at night. The road twists and turns, flanked by towering cliffs on one side and sheer drops on the other. I was on my way to a friend's cabin, taking what I thought was a scenic shortcut, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the mountains seemed to take on a life of their own, shadows stretching and shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. The feeling of being utterly alone, miles from civilization, was chilling enough, but then I noticed the car behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another traveler on the same winding road. But after a few turns, I realized the car was staying unnervingly close, headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but the car matched my pace, tailing me like a predator stalking its prey. A sense of dread began to creep in, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. What were they playing at? The road was too narrow for games, too dangerous for carelessness. I tried to shake the car by taking an unexpected turn onto a dirt road that branched off the main route. The headlights vanished behind me, and for a moment, felt a wave of relief. That feeling quickly faded when I realized the road was a dead end, leading to a sheer drop overlooking the valley below. My heart raced as I threw the car into reverse. Before I could back out, the headlights reappeared, this time at the entrance to the road. There was no way out. I was trapped. The other car's engine roared as it sped toward me, and I barely had time to react. I swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding a collision, but the impact sent my car skidding toward the edge. Tires kicked up dirt and gravel as I fought to regain control, the abyss yawning just inches away. The other driver pulled up alongside me, and I caught a glimpse of his face, a twisted mask of rage and madness, eyes wide with some unspeakable intent. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was in serious danger. Desperation kicked in, and I slammed the car into gear, flooring the accelerator. The tires squealed as I shot forward, dodging the other car by mere inches. I sped back onto the main road, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears, but I wasn't safe yet. The car was back on my tail, closer than ever. The narrow road left no room for error. Every turn felt like it could be my last. The mountains seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing down like a weight. Suddenly, the road ahead opened up into a small clearing, and without thinking, I veered off the road, hoping to lose my pursuer in the thick forest beyond. The car jolted violently as it hit uneven ground, branches clawing at the windows like skeletal hands. I kept driving, pushing deeper into the forest, until the trees became too dense to go any further. I killed the engine, plunging the car into silence, and waited, breath held, listening for any sign of the other car. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the rapid thudding of my own heartbeat. Minutes passed like hours, and I began to think I'd lost him. But just as I allowed myself to relax, I heard it, a distant engine revving, growing louder by the second. Panic surged through me as I realized he was still out there, searching for me. Couldn't stay in the car. It was too obvious, too vulnerable. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and made a break for it, running through the trees as fast as my legs would carry me. The forest closed in around me, the darkness so thick it was like wading through ink. The sound of the engine grew fainter, but I didn't dare stop. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far away from the road as possible. But the forest was a maze, and I quickly lost all sense of direction. The trees seemed to shift and twist, closing in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. I tripped over a root and went sprawling, flashlight slipping from my grasp and rolling away into the underbrush. As I scrambled to my feet, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the trees, freezing me in place. It was close, too close. My breath hitched as I realized the man wasn't just chasing me. He was toying with me, hunting me like prey. I scanned the darkness, but the trees revealed nothing. The laugh came again, closer this time, sending a chill down my spine. I had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of him. But the forest felt like it was working against me, the terrain growing rougher, the trees denser. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I stumbled upon a small cabin hidden deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, but I didn't care. I needed shelter, somewhere to hide. I darted inside, slamming the door behind me and throwing the bolt. The cabin was dark, the air thick with dust and decay, but it was a sanctuary compared to the nightmare outside. I backed away from the door, trying to quiet my ragged breathing as I listened for any sign of the man outside. The silence was deafening, every creak of the old wood setting my nerves on edge. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something shifting in the shadows. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized I wasn't alone. There, huddled in the corner, was a figure, wrapped in a filthy blanket, staring at me with hollow, sunken eyes. The air grew thick with a sense of dread as the realization hit me. I had taken refuge in a place far worse than the one I was running from. The figure rose slowly, its movements unnatural, almost jerky, as if it hadn't moved in years. And then it spoke, its voice a raspy whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't have come here." I've always loved the serenity of the forest, the way the trees seem to stretch endlessly into the sky, their leaves rustling softly in the wind. It's a place where I can clear my head, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. That's why I decided to take a solo backpacking trip. A few days in the wilderness, just me and nature. The first day was perfect. The weather was mild, and the trail was easy to follow. But things took a turn when I decided to veer off the beaten path, lured by the promise of a hidden waterfall. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more disoriented I became. The familiar sounds of birds and insects seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I checked my map, but it didn't make sense anymore. None of the landmarks matched what I was seeing. Panic began to set in as the realization dawned on me. I was lost. The forest, once so inviting, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap me. Trees closed in around me, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. Endless trees, tangled underbrush, and no clear path. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how foolish I'd been to leave the trail. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me like grasping hands. The temperature dropped, and with it, my sense of calm. I knew I had to find shelter before nightfall, but every direction seemed to lead me deeper into the unknown. As darkness fell, the forest transformed into something out of a nightmare. The trees loomed like giant, silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. I stumbled upon a small clearing and decided to make camp for the night, setting up my tent with trembling hand. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I tried to sleep, but every sound sent a jolt of fear through me. The forest no longer felt like a place of peace. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was watching me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My heart raced as I listened, trying to determine where they were coming from. Footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they were getting closer. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed as I waited for the intruder to pass. But the footsteps stopped right outside my tent, and I could hear the soft rustle of fabric as if someone, something, was brushing against it. Fear paralyzed me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as I waited for whatever was out there to make its move. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on, fading into the distance. I lay there, drenched in cold sweat, trying to convince myself it was just an animal passing by. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something that had no place in the natural world. Morning couldn't come fast enough, but when the first light of dawn finally filtered through the trees, I packed up my camp in a hurry, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever had been stalking me during the night. The forest seemed even more menacing in the daylight. The once majestic trees now looked twisted and gnarled, their branches forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out for me. I pushed forward, trying to find my way back to the trail. The further I went, the more disoriented I became. My water supply was running low, and my nerves were frayed from the lack of sleep. The sense of being watched never left me, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set my heart racing. I stumbled upon an old, overgrown path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Desperation clouded my judgment, and I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me out of the forest. The path wound through the trees, leading me deeper into the wilderness. That's when I saw him, a man standing in the middle of the path, his back to me. His clothes were tattered, and his hair hung in matted clumps around his face. I called out, relieved to see another person, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, as if he hadn't heard me at all. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something wasn't right. As I got closer, I noticed that his skin was pale, almost translucent, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. When I was just a few feet away, he turned to face me and I froze. His eyes were wild, filled with a madness that sent chills down my spine. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and he took a step toward me, raising his hand as if to grab me. That's when I saw the knife, glinting in the pale light. Instinct took over, and I bolted, tearing through the underbrush as fast as my legs would carry me. I could hear him crashing through the woods behind me, his footsteps growing louder with every second. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I didn't look back. Forests seemed to close in around me, trees a blur as I ran, their twisted branches clawing at my clothes like they were trying to hold me back. My breath came in ragged gasps, the panic surging through me with each step. The man's footsteps were relentless, crashing through the underbrush like a predator on the hunt. The fear that gripped me was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. Primal, all-consuming. My only thought was to keep running, to escape this nightmare at any cost. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I stumbled upon a small stream. The water was icy cold as I splashed through it, the shock momentarily clearing my mind. I knew I needed to find a way to lose him. The forest offered little in the way of hiding place. My eyes darted around, searching for anything that could give me an advantage. That's when I spotted a large fallen tree trunk, half hidden by the undergrowth. Without thinking, I dove behind it, crouching low and trying to quiet my breathing. Footsteps grew closer, more erratic, as the man searched for me. I could hear him muttering to himself, his words incoherent but filled with a madness that made my skin crawl. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I waited. Every muscle tensed for what would come next. The forest, which had once been my refuge, now felt like a living nightmare. Shadows closing in around me as the man's footsteps slowed. He was close, too close. I could hear him just on the other side of the tree trunk, breath heavy and labored. For a moment, I thought he had found me, but then the footsteps moved away, retreating back into the forest. I waited, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion, until I was sure he was gone. When the silence finally returned, I dared to peek over the trunk, my eyes scanning the woods for any sign of him. The forest was empty once again. The sense of danger lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over me. I knew I couldn't stay there. Summoning the last of my strength, I pushed myself up and started moving again, this time more cautiously. I didn't know how far I had to go to find safety. I was determined to get out of that forest. As I walked, I kept to the edges of the stream, using the water to cover my tracks, hoping it would throw him off my trail. The further I went, the more the forest began to open up, the trees thinning out as I neared what I hoped was the edge of the woods. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged from the forest, stumbling onto a dirt road. Relief flooded through me as I realized I was no longer trapped in that twisted maze of trees. The road was deserted, but it was a sign of civilization, of safety. I didn't stop walking until I reached a small roadside diner a few miles down the road. The people inside stared at me as I entered, disheveled and shaken, and I didn't care. I had made it out alive. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the woods. Who was he? How long had he been out there, and what had driven him to such madness? I never found out, and perhaps that's for the best. The forest, once my sanctuary, has been tainted by the memory of that terrifying encounter. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. Some places I've learned are best left to the wild, and to the things that lurk within. I've always been careful about who I hitch a ride with, but that night, desperation got the better of me. The rain was coming down in sheets, the wind howling through the trees, and I was miles from anywhere, soaked to the bone. When Tom pulled over in his old, beat-up pickup, I didn't think twice about climbing in. He seemed friendly enough, middle-aged, a bit rough around the edges, but he offered me a dry seat and a lift into town. I figured I'd be safe enough for the short drive. Couldn't have been more wrong. At first, everything seemed fine. We made small talk, kind you make with strangers, where I was headed, what brought me out in such terrible weather. Something about Tom started to put me on edge. His answers were vague, his questions a bit too personal. And then there was the way he looked at me. Out of the corner of his eye, he was sizing me up. The rain pounded on the roof, the windshield wipers squeaking rhythmically, but inside the truck, chilling tension building. As we drove deeper into the night, the conversation took a turn. Tom started talking about things that made my skin crawl. Stories about the people who disappeared in the accidents that weren't really accidents. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he was sharing secrets meant for my ears alone. The more he talked, the more uneasy I became. I tried to laugh it off, to change the subject, but he just kept going, his eyes never leaving the road, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Then, without warning, he took a sharp turn off the main road, onto a narrow, winding path that led deeper into the woods. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I had no idea where we were. "Shortcut," said, voice flat, devoid of any warmth. The way he said it, with that eerie smile playing on his lips, sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I had to get out of that truck, but the storm outside was raging, and we were in the middle of nowhere. I was trapped. The rain intensified, turning the path into a muddy quagmire, and the truck's tires struggled for traction. Tom slowed down, peering through the windshield as if searching for something, or someone. I could feel my pulse quicken, my mind racing with possible escape route. But every time I thought about bolting, I remembered the stories he'd told, the warnings about what happened to people who wandered off alone in the dark. Had to play it cool, had to wait for the right moment. We rounded a bend, and up ahead, I saw a faint light through the trees, a small, run-down cabin with a single flickering bulb over the porch. Tom pulled the truck to a stop, his smile widening as he looked at me. "Just need to make a quick stop," he said, turning off the engine. My stomach twisted in knots as he got out of the truck, leaving the keys in the ignition. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I had to decide, stay and face whatever was in that cabin, or make a run for it into the storm. I chose the storm. I grabbed the keys and jumped into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I fumbled to start the engine. But before I could get the truck moving, Tom appeared at the driver's side window, his face twisted in anger, his fist slamming against the glass. The truck roared to life, and I floored the accelerator, the tires spinning in the mud before finally catching. The truck lurched forward, throwing Tom off balance, and I didn't look back. The path was a blur as I sped away, the rain hammering down, the trees whipping by. My heart pounded in my chest as I drove blindly through the storm, not knowing where I was going, just needing to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Tom was somehow still out there, tracking me. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep just behind me. It was as if the storm itself had come alive, conspiring to trap me. After what felt like hours, the road finally spit me out onto a highway, the lights of a distant town glimmering on the horizon. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my hands aching from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. I'd made it. I was safe, or so I thought. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, barely visible through the rain, was a pair of headlights following me at a steady pace. Traveling for work always had its perks. New places to explore, a break from routine. But that night, I would have given anything to be at home. The hotel was one of those old, grand buildings that had seen better days, with faded carpets and creaky floors. I checked in late, tired from a long day of meetings, looking forward to nothing more than a good night's sleep. But the moment I stepped into my room, I had the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. The air was thick, with a strange, almost tangible tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion, but as I unpacked, I noticed something odd. The window was slightly ajar, letting in a draft that made the curtains flutter. I was sure I hadn't opened it. My pulse quickened as I crossed the room to close it, peering out into the dark alley below. The streets were empty, silent except for the distant hum of traffic. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I just needed some rest. The nagging sense of unease wouldn't let go. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the soft creak of floorboards just outside my door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone walking down the hallway. I held my breath, listening as they stopped right in front of my room. The doorknob rattled slightly, as if someone was testing it, and then there was a soft tap, tap, tap on the door, like a knock. Too quiet, too hesitant. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. The knocking stopped, but I didn't move. I was too scared to even breathe. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours, before I finally mustered the courage to get up and check the door. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see an empty hallway, but instead, I saw him. A man standing just a few feet away, staring directly at the peephole, as if he knew I was watching. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but his eyes, there was something chilling in them, something that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the phone to call the front desk. But before I could dial, the phone rang. Shrill tones slicing through the silence like a knife. I nearly jumped out of my skin as I picked it up, my voice barely a whisper as I answered. "Hello?" There was no response, just the faint sound of breathing on the other end. My heart raced, and I slammed the phone down, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. I threw on my clothes, grabbed my bag, and headed for the door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. The man was gone, but the air was thick, the lingering sense of his presence. I hurried to the elevator, my heart pounding in my ears, feeling like I was being watched the entire time. When the elevator doors finally closed, I let out a shaky breath, my mind racing with what had just happened. I needed to get out of the hotel, to leave this place behind and never look back. But as I stepped out into the lobby, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A man was there, sitting in one of the armchairs, casually reading a newspaper, as if he hadn't just been stalking me. He looked up as I walked by, giving me a slow, eerie smile that made my skin crawl. Quickened my pace, nearly running out of the hotel and into the rain-soaked street. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to be far away from that man, from that hotel. I spent the night at a different hotel across town, barricading the door with a chair and leaving the lights on. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, that he knew where I was. When morning finally came, I checked out as quickly as I could, not daring to look back as I left the city. But the memory of that night stayed with me. Haunting reminder that sometimes the things we fear most are closer than we think. Being a delivery driver usually meant late nights, but I never thought it would lead to a night like this. The order came in just before closing, a last-minute delivery to a house way out on the outskirts of town. The address was unfamiliar, tucked away in a part of the city I'd never ventured into before. The streets grew darker and more deserted as I drove, the houses spaced further apart, until finally I reached the address. The house was an old, sprawling Victorian, its windows dark and unwelcoming, like empty eyes staring back at me. I hesitated before getting out of the car, something about the place giving me the creeps. But a job was a job, so I grabbed the food and made my way up the overgrown path to the front door. The doorbell didn't seem to work, so I knocked, the sound echoing through the silent house. I waited, but no one answered. Just as I was about to knock again, the door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the shadows. He didn't say anything, just motioned for me to come inside. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. But I didn't want to be rude, or worse, lose a tip. So I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me. The house was dark, the only light coming from a flickering candle on a small table by the door. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something metallic and sharp. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with an unsettling intensity that made my skin crawl. I handed him the food, eager to get out of there, but he just stood there, staring. When I finally managed to ask for payment, he smiled. A slow, eerie smile that sent chills down my spine. "No need," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You'll be staying for dinner." My heart skipped a beat as I realized the door was locked. Key nowhere in sight. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to think of a way out. The man stepped closer, his smile widening, and I could see the glint of something sharp in his hand. It wasn't until he raised it that I saw it was a knife. I bolted for the door, but he was faster, slamming me against the wall with a force that knocked the breath out of me. The knife flashed in the dim light, and I braced myself for the worst. But instead of stabbing me, he brought it up to his own face, tracing the blade along his cheek with a twisted grin. "You're not going anywhere," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. Desperation took over, and I lashed out, kicking him as hard as I could. He stumbled back, giving me just enough time to make a break for it. I ran through the house, my heart pounding in my chest, the shadows twisting and turning as I searched for an escape. Every door I tried was locked, every window barred. The house was a maze, each turn leading me deeper into the nightmare. I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, as if he knew there was no way out. My mind raced, trying to find a solution. The panic was overwhelming, clouding my thoughts. Just when I thought I was trapped, I spotted a small, narrow staircase leading down to the basement. It was a risk, but I had no other choice. I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step, the darkness thickening around me. The basement was damp and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes stacked haphazardly. I crouched behind a stack of crates, trying to steady my breathing, listening for any sign that he'd followed me. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Couldn't tell. The basement was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I started to believe I'd lost him, that maybe he'd given up. But just as I allowed myself to relax, I heard it. Soft creak of the stairs, the sound of someone descending slowly, deliberately. My blood ran cold as I realized he was coming for me, and there was nowhere left to run. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed a rusted pipe from the floor, holding it like a weapon as I waited in the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could see the faint outline of him at the bottom of the stairs. He moved slowly, methodically, as if savoring the moment. I tightened my grip on the pipe, my heart racing as I prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Then, just as he stepped into the basement, power flickered back on, and the basement was flooded with harsh, fluorescent light. The man froze, his twisted grin fading as he looked at me, the momentary shock giving me the opening I needed. I swung the pipe with all my strength, the impact sending him crashing to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he was down for good. I ran, stumbling up the stairs and through the house, finally finding an unlocked window that I scrambled out of, falling onto the overgrown lawn outside. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back at the house, at the man who had nearly ended my life. The night air was cold, but I didn't care. I was alive. I had escaped. But the memory of that night would haunt me forever. Chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. Camping trips are supposed to be a time to unwind, to escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life and reconnect with nature. That's what we thought when we packed up the car and headed out to the secluded campsite deep in the woods. It was just the four of us, me, my partner, and our two kids, looking forward to a weekend of roasting marshmallows and telling stories by the fire. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The air was still, almost too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. First night passed without incident, though the sense of unease never quite left me. The fire crackled softly, casting eerie shadows on the trees, but we laughed it off, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings. Kids were excited, and we didn't want to dampen their spirits. But as the night wore on, couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by too many late-night horror movies. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The second night, things started to get strange. We were gathered around the campfire, the kids roasting marshmallows, when we heard it. Faint whisper carried on the wind, so soft that at first I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, like a voice calling from somewhere deep in the woods. Kids didn't seem to notice, but my partner and I exchanged uneasy glances. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just the wind playing tricks, but the tension in the air was palpable. As we settled in for the night, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the tent flap ominously. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it again, a whisper, closer this time, and the distinct sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear more. Footsteps stopped just outside the tent, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing. Then, slowly, I reached over to shake my partner awake. But before I could, footsteps continued, moving away from the tent and fading into the night. The next morning, we found something that chilled us to the bone. Surrounding our campsite were dozens of footprints, too large to be human, and spaced too far apart to belong to any animal we knew. The ground was trampled, as if something, or someone, had circled our tent repeatedly during the night. The kids were still asleep, oblivious to the discovery, but my partner and I knew we had to leave. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something we wanted to encounter again. We packed up in record time, but as we were loading the car, the eerie feeling returned. The forest was dead silent. No birds, no insects, just the occasional creak of the trees. And then, as we were about to get in the car, we saw them. Figures standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching us. They were tall, too tall to be people, their silhouettes dark against the bright morning light. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring. Cold wave of fear washed over me as I hurried the kids into the car, my heart pounding in my chest. We drove away as fast as we could, eerie figures disappearing into the distance. But even as we left the campsite far behind, a sense of dread lingered. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures following us, but the road was empty. Kids chattered away in the back seat, unaware of how close we had come to what? We still don't know. We didn't talk about it much afterward, but every now and then, my partner and I would exchange a knowing look, a reminder of that chilling weekend. We never went back to that campsite. In fact, we stopped camping altogether. The memory of that weekend still haunts us, a reminder that some places are best left alone. The woods may seem peaceful, but they can hold secrets that are better off forgotten. Sometimes, the wilderness isn't as empty as it appears, and the things that lurk in the shadows are far more terrifying than any campfire story. There's a certain thrill that comes with owning a classic car. The gleam of polished chrome, the deep rumble of the engine, the way it turns heads wherever you go. That's how I felt the day I bought my dream car, a vintage muscle car that I'd been saving up for years to buy. It was a beauty, restored to perfection, and I couldn't wait to take it for a spin. But what started as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. The trouble began almost immediately. On my first drive, I noticed a car tailing me, an old, beat-up sedan that seemed out of place in the upscale neighborhood I was cruising through. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were admiring the car like I was. But as I made turn after turn, the sedan stayed right behind me, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. My heart started to race as I realized this wasn't just someone admiring my new ride. I decided to test my theory and took a sudden turn down a side street, hoping to lose them. But the sedan followed, its engine roaring as it sped up, keep pace. Panic surged through me as I realized I was being followed, but I didn't know why. I pushed the car to its limits, engine growling as I swerved through the streets, trying to shake them. But no matter what I did, they were always there, lurking just a few car lengths behind. As night fell, the streets grew darker, the shadows longer, and the fear that had been simmering all day turned into full-blown terror. I was miles from home, driving through a part of town I didn't know, with no idea how to escape. The sedan's headlights loomed closer, practically touching my bumper, and I could see the figures inside, dark silhouettes that seemed to blend with the night itself. I had to get away. The narrow, winding roads left me with few options. Just when I thought I'd lost them, the sedan swerved in front of me, forcing me to slam on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, and before I could react, the doors of the sedan flew open, and 3 men stepped out. They were big, burly, and mean-looking, the kind of hard faces that told you they were bad news. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do. I was trapped, with nowhere to run, and no one around to help. One of the men approached my car, a sinister smile curling on his lips as he tapped on the window with a crowbar. "Nice ride," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "Shame if something happened to it." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized they weren't after me, they were after the car. But they didn't just want to steal it. They wanted to make me pay for having it, teach me a lesson for daring to own something so valuable. Before I could respond, the man swung the crowbar, shattering the driver's side window. I barely had time to react before he yanked the door open, dragging me out of the car with brutal force. The others moved in, surrounding me, their faces twisted with sadistic glee. They taunted me, shoving me around, making it clear they were in control. I tried to fight back, but there were too many of them, and they were too strong. Just when I thought it was over, that they were going to leave me battered and broken on the side of the road, something changed. A sound, distant roar, growing louder, caught their attention. They looked up, confused, as a set of blinding headlights appeared at the end of the street, barreling toward us at breakneck speed. The men scattered, diving out of the way as the vehicle careened toward us. I barely had time to register what was happening before the car slammed into the sedan, sending it spinning into a ditch. In the chaos, I managed to scramble back to my car, bloodied and bruised, still breathing. I didn't wait to see what would next. I floored the accelerator and tore out of there, the engine roaring as I sped down the empty streets. The mysterious car didn't follow me, and when I finally made it home, parked the muscle car in the garage and locked it up tight, my hands still shaking from the encounter. I never saw those men again, and I never found out who or what saved me that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the car had a mind of its own, that it wasn't just a machine, but something more. Something with a dark past and a will of its own. I still drive it, but every time I get behind the wheel, I can't help but wonder if the trouble is really over, or if it's just waiting to strike again. Living in a small town has its perks. Everyone knows everyone, and there's a sense of community that you just don't get in the city. That familiarity can also be suffocating, especially when someone decides to take an unhealthy interest in you. That's what happened to me when I started taking my car to the local mechanic, a guy named Jerry. At first, he seemed friendly enough, always ready with a smile and a joke. But as time went on, his attention started to feel less like friendly banter and more like something darker. It started with little things. Jerry would call me to update me on my car's repairs, even when I hadn't asked for any updates. He'd show up at the diner where I worked, always at the end of my shift, just to chat. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just lonely, looking for someone to talk to. But then he started appearing at places he shouldn't have known I'd be: the grocery store, park, even outside my house. It was eerie, like he was always one step ahead, always watching. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. The final straw came one evening when I was leaving work. It was late, and the parking lot was deserted, save for one car, Jerry's truck, parked right next to mine. He was leaning against the hood, arms crossed, that same unsettling smile on his face. "Hey there," he said casually, as if it was perfectly normal for him to be waiting for me in the dark. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced a smile, trying to act like everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. I hurried to unlock my car, my hands shaking, but Jerry didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, his eyes following my every move. As I got into the car, he leaned in close, tapping on the window. "You know," he said, his voice low and almost threatening, "it's not safe for a girl like you to be out here all alone. You never know who might be watching." The way he said it sent chills down my spine, and I didn't waste any time. I drove off as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles white. I tried to avoid Jerry after that, taking my car to a different mechanic and changing my routine to avoid running into him. But it didn't work. He kept showing up, always with a smile, always pretending like everything was normal. It was terrifying, the way he could make something so sinister seem so innocent. I started to feel like I was losing my mind, questioning whether I was overreacting or if there really was something dangerous about him. Things escalated one night when I got home to find my door unlocked. I knew I had locked it before I left, and my heart dropped as I stepped inside, my mind racing with possibility. The house was dark, eerily quiet, and as I moved from room to room, a growing sense of dread settled over me. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it, a note on the kitchen table, written in Jerry's familiar handwriting, "See you soon." Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my phone to call the police, but as I dialed, I heard a creak from upstairs. My blood ran cold as I realized he was still in the house. I bolted for the door. Before I could reach it, I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, getting closer with each step. I didn't wait to see him. I ran out of the house, my heart pounding in my ears, and didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's yard. I called the police from there, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. When the police arrived, they searched the house but found nothing. No sign of Jerry, no fingerprints, nothing to prove he had been there at all. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving only that chilling note behind. Police took my concerns seriously, but without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I changed the locks, installed security cameras, and even stayed with a friend for a few nights. Fear never really went away. Jerry never showed up again, and after a while, life started to return to normal. But I never felt truly safe after that night. The memory of his eyes, sinister smile, and the feeling of being hunted still haunts me. In a small town, it's hard to escape someone who's decided to fixate on you. And though Jerry may have disappeared, fear he instilled in me remains. A chilling reminder that not all monsters hide in the dark. Some walk among us, wearing friendly faces. I've always loved the solitude of the Maine woods, the way the trees seem to whisper secrets as you hike through them. That's why I often ventured deep into the forest, far from the beaten path, where few people dared to go. But one autumn afternoon, my peaceful hike took a turn for the eerie, and I stumbled upon a young boy, no more than 8 years old, wandering alone among the trees. His clothes were dirty, his face smeared with tears, and when he saw me, he ran up, clinging to my leg like I was his lifeline. At first, I tried to calm him down, asking where his parents were, but the boy couldn't answer, his eyes wide with fear. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone or something to appear at any moment. The forest, usually so serene, suddenly felt oppressive, the shadows darker, the silence more ominous. My gut told me something was very wrong, and without thinking, I decided to get the boy to safety. I picked him up and started back toward the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. We hadn't gone far when I heard voices, low, harsh voices, coming from somewhere behind us. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was enough to send chills down my spine. The boy's grip tightened around my neck, and I knew we had to move faster. I quickened my pace, trying to stay quiet, hoping the underbrush would hide us. But the voices grew louder, closer, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they were following us. Panic surged through me as I realized we were being hunted. Whoever was out there wasn't just looking for the boy, they were after both of us now. The forest that had always been my sanctuary had turned into a maze of shadows and fear. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of terror through me. The boy buried his face in my shoulder, his small body trembling with fear. I knew we had to find a place to hide, to wait them out. The forest offered little refuge. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, I spotted a narrow crevice in a rock formation, just big enough for us to squeeze into. It wasn't much, but it was our only option. I ducked inside, pulling the boy in after me, and we huddled together in the dark, trying to stay as silent as possible. The voices were right on top of us now, and I could hear the crunch of boots on the forest floor, the sound sending a chill down my spine. They were so close I could smell the stale scent of sweat and cigarettes. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. The seconds stretched into an eternity, and I could feel the boy's heart pounding against my chest. Footsteps slowed, stopping just outside our hiding place. My heart nearly stopped when I saw a shadow pass over the entrance to the crevice, the faint beam of a flashlight sweeping across the ground. The boy whimpered, and I clamped a hand over his mouth, my own breath coming in shallow gasps. We were so close to being discovered, it was terrifying. The flashlight beam lingered for a moment, and I could almost feel the eyes of our pursuers searching the darkness. But then, mercifully, the light moved on, and I heard the footsteps retreating. We stayed hidden, not daring to move until the voices faded into the distance. When I was sure they were gone, I finally allowed myself to breathe, my body trembling with adrenaline. We couldn't stay in the forest. It was too dangerous. We had to get out, but we had to do it quietly, carefully. I led the boy back onto the trail, sticking to the shadows, moving as quickly and silently as we could. The forest was still and eerily quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, and I was ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Boy clung to me, his trust in my ability to protect him both comforting and terrifying. We had to keep moving, had to get to safety before they realized we were gone. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the edge of the forest. The sight of the road was a welcome relief, and I nearly cried when I saw the headlights of a passing car. We flagged it down, the driver, a kind woman, taking one look at us, and understanding we were in trouble. She drove us straight to the nearest police station, where I told them everything. The boy, still too shaken to speak, clung to me until the officers gently pried him away. It turned out the boy had been kidnapped, and the men in the forest were part of a criminal ring that had been operating in the area. Thanks to our escape, the police were able to track them down and bring them to justice. I never expected a simple hike to turn into a chilling encounter with danger, but it reminded me that even in the most peaceful places, something eerie can be lurking just out of sight. Hiking in the Swiss Alps had always been a dream of mine. Crisp mountain air, the stunning vistas, the sense of being on top of the world. So when I finally had the chance to go, I jumped at it, setting out on a solo trek through the snow-capped peaks. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for, clear skies and breathtaking scenery. But on the third day, I crossed paths with another hiker, and my peaceful adventure quickly turned into a chilling ordeal I'll never forget. He appeared out of nowhere, a man in his late 30s with a rugged look that seemed at odds with the solitude of the mountain. At first, he was friendly enough, striking up a conversation about the trail and the unpredictable weather. We walked together for a while, but something about him made me uneasy. His questions were a bit too probing, his smile bit too forced. The feeling of being alone on the mountain had been comforting, but now, with this stranger beside me, it became unsettling. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. He seemed overly interested in where I was headed and how long I'd be out there alone. The more we talked, the more my instincts told me to be cautious. There was something eerie about the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up for something. I decided to cut the hike short and head back to the nearest village, making an excuse about the weather turning bad. But when I mentioned leaving, his demeanor shifted. The friendly facade dropped, replaced by a cold, calculating look that sent a chill down my spine. He insisted that I stay on the trail, that it was too dangerous to turn back now. The way he said it, with a hint of menace in his voice, made my heart race. I knew then that I had to get away from him, but the narrow mountain path offered little room for escape. The tension between us was palpable, the air growing colder with every step. As we continued to walk, I started looking for an opportunity to slip away, but he stayed close, matching my pace. The trail was steep and treacherous, with sheer drops on one side and rocky cliffs on the other. The isolation that had once felt liberating now felt like a trap, and I began to regret venturing so far from civilization. The man's presence was oppressive, and I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. The mountains, once majestic, now loomed over me, casting long, eerie shadows. Then, as we rounded a bend, I saw my chance, a narrow side path that led into a dense forest. Without thinking, I broke into a run, darting down the path as fast as I could. I heard him shout behind me, his footsteps pounding the ground as he gave chase. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, the trees closing in around me, the branches slapping against my face. The forest was dark and disorienting, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The sound of his pursuit grew fainter, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs burning with the effort. The path twisted and turned, and I stumbled over roots and rocks, but I kept going. I knew if I stopped, he would catch up, and the thought of what he might do filled me with a chilling terror. The forest, with its towering pines and thick underbrush, became a maze, and I prayed that it would be enough to lose him. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged from the forest, my legs shaking with exhaustion. I found myself on a wide, open plateau, the village visible in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I forced myself to keep moving, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see him emerge from the trees. But the forest remained still and silent, the only sound the wind whistling through the mountain. When I finally reached the village, I went straight to the local authorities, telling them everything. They took my story seriously, and it wasn't long before they discovered the truth. The man was a fugitive, wanted for a string of violent crimes across Europe. The thought of how close I'd come to being his next victim sent a shiver down my spine. The mountains, once a place of peace and beauty, now held a haunting memory, a danger I hadn't seen coming. Motels have always had a certain unsettling charm to them, the kind of places where people come and go without much notice, where anonymity is the rule. That night, after a long drive through a desolate stretch of highway, I found myself pulling into one such place. It was a run-down, almost forgotten motel on the outskirts of a small town, the kind of spot that you'd only stop at out of sheer exhaustion. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement, and I could see that the parking lot was nearly empty. Something about the place felt off, but I was too tired to care. The lobby was dimly lit, with faded wallpaper peeling off the walls and a musty smell that clung to the air. The man behind the counter was a gruff-looking fellow, his eyes cold and distant as he handed me the key to room 13. I couldn't help but notice the faint stains on the keychain, but I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the motel's general state of disrepair. With a weary sigh, I made my way down the narrow hallway, floor creaking under my feet with each step. As I unlocked the door to my room, a chill ran down my spine. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb above the bed. The air was thick and stale, and there was a strange metallic scent that I couldn't quite place. I flicked on the overhead light, and that's when I noticed it. The bedspread was stained, large splotches of something dark and dried that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. My stomach churned as I realized it looked an awful lot like blood. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just rust or spilled coffee, but the rational part of my mind knew better. I hesitated for a moment, considering whether I should just leave and find another place to stay. But the thought of getting back on the road, of driving through the night without rest, seemed impossible. I decided to stay, convincing myself that I was being paranoid. I put my bag down on the floor and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at my insides. As I unpacked, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. The room felt wrong, as if it was hiding secrets in its shadows. I tried to settle in, but every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes, made me jump. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and I knew I wouldn't be getting much sleep that night. Later, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a soft, almost imperceptible tapping, like fingernails gently drumming on a hard surface. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind the bed. I froze, listening intently, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, and then it stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could feel the fear tightening in my chest. I got up, my hands trembling as I searched the room for anything out of place. That's when I noticed something strange. The dresser, which had been pushed up against the wall, seemed slightly off kilter. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to investigate. With a deep breath, I moved the dresser aside, revealing a small, crudely cut hole in the wall. My heart nearly stopped when I realized what I was looking at, a peephole, one that led directly to the room next door. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I quickly covered the hole and pushed the dresser back into place, but the damage was done. I couldn't stay in that room, not knowing that someone might have been watching me. I grabbed my things and headed for the door, but as I reached for the doorknob, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A soft, raspy breathing coming from just outside the door. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears as I listened to the sound of someone, or something, standing just on the other side. I knew I couldn't stay in that room, but the thought of opening the door and coming face to face with whoever or whatever was out there filled me with terror. I backed away slowly, my mind racing for a plan. The only thing I could think of was to wait it out, hoping that whatever was out there would leave. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing finally stopped. I waited a few more minutes, just to be sure, and then I cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the flickering lights. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the exit, not stopping until I was safely in my car with the doors locked. As I drove away from that motel, couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. I never looked back, but the memory of that night still haunts me. There was something chilling about that place, something I couldn't explain. Whether it was the stains on the bedspread, peephole in the wall, or the raspy breathing outside my door, I'll never know for sure what was going on in that motel. But one thing is certain, I'll never stay in a place like that again. There's a certain loneliness that comes with being a lighthouse keeper, but it's a loneliness I've always embraced. The isolation, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks, the endless horizon. These were my companions in a world that felt removed from time. My lighthouse was perched on a rugged cliff, miles away from the nearest town, and I spent my days ensuring the light never faltered, guiding ships safely through the treacherous waters below. But one stormy night, that solitude was shattered in the most terrifying way. The storm rolled in quickly, sky turning a deep, ominous gray as thunder rumbled in the distance. I had seen storms like this before, but something about this one felt different, more menacing, The wind howled through the cracks in the lighthouse, and the waves surged with a fury that shook the very foundation of the tower. I was on edge, checking and rechecking the light to ensure it was strong enough to pierce through the storm. That's when I heard the pounding on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came out here, especially not in weather like this. Pounding grew more urgent, and I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. There, drenched and wild-eyed, stood a sailor, clothes torn and his face pale with fear. He claimed his ship had been caught in the storm and wrecked on the rocks below. I knew I couldn't turn him away, so I let him in, offering him shelter from the storm. The moment he stepped inside, I knew I had made a mistake. There was something off about him, something that set my nerves on edge. His eyes darted around the room, never settling on one spot for too long, and he muttered to himself in a low, raspy voice that I could barely understand. I tried to ask him what had happened, but his answers were vague, his voice trembling with something more than just fear of the storm. As the night wore on, the atmosphere inside the lighthouse grew tense, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this man was hiding something. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling louder and the waves crashing with even more force. The lighthouse, usually a place of refuge, felt claustrophobic with the sailor inside. He paced the room, his movements erratic, and I noticed him glancing at the light above with a strange intensity. When I asked him what he was looking at, he turned to me with a chilling smile and said, "The sea never forgets." The way he said it, with a twisted sort of reverence, sent a shiver down my spine. Then, without warning, the light at the top of the tower flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to relight it, my hands shaking with urgency. The sailor just stood there, watching me with that same eerie smile, as if he knew something I didn't. When I finally got the light back on, I turned to him, demanding to know what was going on. But his response was a cryptic whisper, "It's here." Before I could ask him what he meant, the lighthouse began to tremble, as if something massive was moving beneath it. The sailor's expression twisted into one of pure terror, and he backed away from the windows, muttering to himself in a language I didn't understand. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, and I could feel the presence of something dark and ancient pressing in on us from all sides. The sailor began to laugh, a low, haunting sound that echoed through the room. I grabbed him, shaking him, trying to snap him out of whatever trance he was in, but it was no use. He kept laughing, his eyes wide with a kind of manic glee that terrified me. Then, with a sudden burst of strength, he pushed me away and ran to the door, flinging it open to the storm outside. I shouted for him to stop, but he didn't listen. He ran out into the night, disappearing into the swirling mist and rain. I tried to follow, but the wind was too strong, nearly knocking me off my feet. I watched helplessly as the sailor vanished into the darkness, his laughter still ringing in my ears. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding with fear. The lighthouse felt even more oppressive now, the storm outside a mirror to the chaos inside. I spent the rest of the night in a state of high alert, jumping at every sound, every creak of the old wood. The storm finally began to subside in the early hours of the morning, but the sense of unease lingered. When daylight broke, I ventured outside, searching for any sign of the sailor. He was gone, leaving no trace behind. The rocks below were slick with seawater, but there was no sign of a shipwreck, no debris, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there at all. The only thing I found was a piece of tattered fabric caught on a jagged rock, the same fabric the sailor had been wearing. I knew then that whatever had happened that night was something far beyond my understanding. The lighthouse has never felt the same since. The sense of solitude that I once cherished now feels like a heavy burden. Constant reminder of that stormy night and the chilling encounter with a man, or perhaps something not quite human. The sea may never forget, but neither will I. There's a strange sense of vulnerability that comes with being alone at a gas station late at night, especially on a deserted stretch of road. I was on a long drive, heading through a part of the country I didn't know well, when I realized I was running low on gas. The only option was a small, isolated gas station that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was one of those old, run-down places with flickering lights and a single, rusty pump. As I pulled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. The station was empty, not another car or person in sight, which only added to the eerie atmosphere. I got out of the car, the cold night air hitting me as I started to pump gas. The only sound was the wind whistling through the nearby trees, and the faint hum of the gas pump. I kept glancing around, half expecting someone to appear. The place remained deserted. Just as I was about to finish up, a beat-up old truck pulled in, its engine growling as it came to a stop at the pump next to mine. The man got out of the truck, and the moment I saw him, my instincts screamed at me to be careful. He was tall and rough-looking, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to glint with something unsettling. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with a cold intensity that made my skin crawl. I offered a polite nod and quickly finished pumping gas, eager to get back on the road. But as I got into my car, I noticed he wasn't filling up his tank. He was just standing there, watching me. The unease I'd felt earlier grew into full-blown fear as I started the car and pulled away from the station. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man get back into his truck, his headlights flaring to life as he followed me out onto the road. My heart began to race as I realized he was tailing me, staying just close enough to make his presence known. The road ahead was long and dark, with no turnoffs or places to pull over, and I knew I was in trouble. I tried to keep calm, focusing on the road and hoping he'd eventually lose interest, but he stayed right on my tail, his headlights glaring in my mirrors. I pressed down on the accelerator, but the truck matched my speed, never letting me out of its sight. The tension in the car was suffocating, every nerve in my body screaming for me to do something, but there was nowhere to go, no way to outrun him on this desolate stretch of highway. Suddenly, the road forked, and without thinking, I took the smaller, narrower path, hoping to shake him. The truck hesitated for a moment before following, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beams of menace. The road wound through dense woods, the trees closing in around me, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. I could feel the fear tightening in my chest, every instinct urging me to keep going, to find a way out. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint, flickering light through the trees. Another road, a way to escape. I veered off the main path, the car jolting as I hit the uneven ground, the branches scratching against the windows like claws. The truck roared behind me, but the narrow, twisting trail seemed to confuse the driver, and I could see the headlights wavering as he struggled to keep up. My heart pounded as I pushed the car harder, desperate to lose him. The trail led me to a small, abandoned cabin, barely visible in the gloom. I had no other choice. I killed the engine and doused the lights, praying that the truck would pass by without noticing me. I could hear the roar of its engine getting closer, the sound sending chills down my spine. I crouched low in the driver's seat, holding my breath as the truck thundered past, its headlights sweeping over the trees and disappearing into the night. I waited for what felt like hours, the silence pressing in on me, before I finally dared to breathe again. The truck was gone, and I was alone in the dark, eerie woods. I didn't dare move, didn't dare start the car again, afraid that he might still be out there, lurking in the shadows. I spent the rest of the night in that cabin, every creak and rustle outside sending my heart racing. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously made my way back to the road, relieved to see no sign of the truck or its driver. I don't know what that man's intentions were, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I narrowly escaped something terrifying that night. The memory of those headlights in my rearview mirror, feeling of being hunted on that lonely road, still haunts me. I've never driven through that part of the country again, and I don't think I ever will. There's something both fascinating and unsettling about ghost town. The remnants of lives once lived, now abandoned and left to the ravages of time. As a travel blogger, I'd always been drawn to these eerie places, hoping to capture their haunting beauty and share it with my readers. So when I found out about an old, forgotten town hidden deep in the desert, I knew I had to visit. The journey was long and arduous, but the thought of exploring a place untouched by modern life kept me going. When I finally arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the crumbling buildings. The town was exactly as I'd imagined, empty, desolate, and strangely captivating. I wandered through the dusty streets, my footsteps echoing in the silence, taking pictures of the decaying storefronts and broken windows. There was something almost peaceful about the place, but beneath that calm surface, I could sense a lingering presence, as if the town was still holding on to the memories of those who had once lived there. As the light faded, the town took on a more sinister appearance. The shadows grew longer, and the air grew colder, despite the desert heat. I decided to take a few more shots before heading back. But as I was setting up my camera, I noticed something strange. A figure standing at the edge of my frame. I lowered the camera and looked around, but there was no one there. The streets were empty, just as they had been when I arrived. I chalked it up to a trick of the light and continued with my work, but the sense of unease stayed with me. As I made my way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The wind whispered through the empty buildings, and every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows flitting between the structures, just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the feeling of unease only grew stronger. By the time I reached the car, my hands were shaking, and I was ready to leave that place behind. But when I turned the key in the ignition, engines sputtered and died. Panic surged through me as I tried again, but the car refused to start. I was stranded, alone in a ghost town, with night rapidly approaching. I got out of the car, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could help. But the town was as empty as ever. The only sounds were the creaking of old wood and the rustling of the wind through the empty streets. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the town into darkness, and that's when I saw them. Figures barely visible in the dim light, moving silently through the streets. At first, I thought they were other visitors, perhaps fellow explorers drawn to the town's eerie allure. But as they came closer, I realized something was very wrong. Their movements were unnatural, almost robotic, and their faces, what little I could see, were expressionless, as if they were sleepwalking. A cold wave of fear washed over me as I backed away, my mind racing for an explanation. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat, the words dying before they could escape. Figures continued to approach, their footsteps eerily silent on the dusty ground. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I darted between the buildings, searching for a place to hide. The town, which had seemed so small and manageable in the daylight, now felt like a maze, the narrow alleys and crumbling structures closing in around me. I ducked into an old saloon, the door creaking loudly as I pushed it open. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the broken windows. I crouched behind the bar, trying to steady my breathing, hoping the figures hadn't seen me. But as I listened to the silence, I realized it wasn't just the figures outside that I had to worry about. The saloon felt wrong, as if it were alive with some dark energy. And I could feel a presence, something unseen, watching me from the shadows. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I heard the creak of the door opening. My heart nearly stopped as I heard the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone, or something, entering the saloon. The air grew thick with tension as the footsteps approached the bar, each one sending a jolt of fear through me. I pressed myself closer to the floor, praying they wouldn't find me, but the footsteps stopped right next to where I was hiding. I held my breath, my body trembling with fear as I waited for the inevitable. But instead of being discovered, the footsteps suddenly retreated, the door creaking shut behind them. I stayed hidden for several more minutes, too terrified to move, before finally gathering the courage to peek over the bar. The saloon was empty, just as it had been before, but the sense of dread remained. I knew I couldn't stay there, not with whatever was lurking in that town. I bolted from the saloon, running through the dark streets, my only goal to get as far away as possible. Figures were gone, but the fear they had instilled in me lingered. When I reached the car, I I tried the ignition one last time, and to my immense relief, the engine roared to life. I didn't waste any time. I sped out of that ghost town as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The experience left me shaken, and I couldn't bring myself to write about it for a long time. There was something deeply unsettling about that town, something I still can't fully explain. It was as if the town itself was alive, haunted by the spirits of those who had once lived there, perhaps by something far more sinister. I visited many eerie places in my travels, but none have left a mark on me like that ghost town did. It's a place I'll never forget, and one I'll never return to. Wyoming's wide-open spaces have always called to me. The vast landscapes offering a sense of freedom and solitude, hard to find anywhere else. But that same isolation can turn eerie when you're far from civilization. And that's exactly what happened during one of my trips through the state. I was on a long drive, making my way through a remote part of Wyoming, when fatigue started to set in. The nearest town was miles away, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew I needed to find a place to rest for the night. That's when I spotted a small, isolated motel just off the highway. It was the only sign of life for miles, its flickering neon sign a beacon in the growing darkness. The motel looked run down, peeling paint and a neglected parking lot. But I was too tired to be picky. I pulled in and parked, noticing only a couple of other cars in the lot, both covered in a thick layer of dust as if they hadn't moved in a long time. The thought crossed my mind that I should keep driving, but exhaustion won out. The lobby was dimly lit, with a musty smell that hinted at years of neglect. The man behind the counter was tall and lean, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to bore into me as I approached. He didn't say much, just handed me the key to room 7 with a nod and a grunt. Something about him made me uneasy, but I chalked it up to the general creepiness of the place. I thanked him and made my way to the room, hoping for nothing more than a few hours of sleep. The room itself was no better than the lobby, dark, dingy, and filled with the smell of mildew. The bed was lumpy, the sheets weren't thin, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. As I set my bag down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence outside was unnerving, almost oppressive, and I found myself double-checking the lock on the door before sitting down on the edge of the bed. Just as I was starting to relax, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. No one should have known I was there. I stood up, hesitating for a moment, before approaching the door. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer, just a second, more insistent knock. The unease I'd felt earlier turned into full-blown fear. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, but something told me not to open it. Instead, I backed away, deciding to peek through the thin curtains. As I pulled them aside, just enough to see, my blood ran cold. 2 men stood just outside, both dressed in what looked like police uniforms, but there was something off about them. Their faces were hard, eyes cold and devoid of any warmth. They were talking to each other in low voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then, one of them turned and looked directly at the window, his gaze meeting mine through the small gap in the curtains. I dropped the curtain and backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't right. Something about these men felt wrong, dangerous. I considered my options, realizing with growing dread that I was trapped. The room had no other exit, and there was nowhere to hide. I tried to think of a plan, but my mind was racing, fear clouding my judgment. The knocking resumed, louder this time, followed by a voice that was too calm, too rehearsed. "Open up. We just want to talk." But I knew better. My instincts screamed at me to stay quiet, to not make a sound. The men outside weren't here to help. They were here for something far more sinister. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. My stomach dropped as I realized just how isolated I truly was. The men outside started to grow impatient, their knocks turning into bangs, the door rattling on its hinges. I had to do something, anything, to get out of this situation. In a moment of desperate inspiration, I moved the dresser in front of the door, hoping it would buy me some time. Then, I noticed the small bathroom window, barely big enough to squeeze through, but it was my only chance. I hurried over, prying it open and struggling to fit through the narrow space. My heart raced as I heard the door splintering behind me, the men shouting as they forced their way inside. I managed to pull myself through the window, dropping to the ground outside just as the door crashed open. I didn't stop to look back. I ran as fast as I could, the cold night air biting at my skin. I sprinted across the parking lot and into the darkness beyond. I could hear the men shouting, their footsteps pounding behind me, but I didn't dare slow down. The only thing on my mind was getting as far away from that motel as possible. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running, driven by pure fear. Eventually, I reached the highway, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. There was no sign of the men, no headlights in the distance, just the long, empty road stretching out before me. I started walking, praying for a passing car, for any sign of help. Felt like hours before I finally saw headlights approaching, and I waved them down, nearly collapsing with relief as the driver pulled over. I explained what had happened as best as I could, and they took me to the nearest town, where I finally felt safe. I never reported the incident, too shaken and unsure of what had really happened to go back. But that night left a scar, a chilling reminder of how quickly a place of supposed refuge can turn into a nightmare. I've since learned to trust my instincts. Never ignore that gut feeling when something feels off. And I vowed never to stay in another isolated motel again. Camping in Texas is supposed to be an adventure, a way to reconnect with nature and escape the hustle of daily life. I'd always enjoyed the vast landscapes, the endless skies, and the peace that comes with being far from civilization. That's why my friends and I decided to spend a long weekend camping in a remote part of Texas, far away from any towns or highways. We wanted to disconnect and enjoy the serenity of the wilderness, but what was meant to be a relaxing getaway quickly turned into a night of sheer terror. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, setting up our tents near a small, bubbling creek. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. Everything seemed perfect. We spent the evening around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories, laughing as the stars appeared one by one in the clear Texas sky. The isolation, the silence, it all felt like a welcome escape from the world. But as the night wore on, peaceful atmosphere began to change. Started with a strange sound in the distance, a low, rumbling noise that we couldn't quite place. At first, we thought it was thunder. The sky was clear. The noise grew louder, closer, and we began to feel a sense of unease. The laughter died down, and we all exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was happening. The sound was unlike anything we'd heard before, a mix of engines and distant shouting. Then, out of nowhere, a group of men appeared at the edge of our campsite, their faces obscured by the shadows. They were armed, carrying rifles slung over their shoulders, and their expressions were hard, menacing. One of them stepped forward, his voice gruff as he demanded to know what we were doing on their land. We tried to explain that we didn't know the area was privately owned, that we were just there to camp for the weekend, but they didn't seem to care. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The men surrounded us, their weapons a constant reminder of how vulnerable we were. They accused us of trespassing, their voices growing louder, more threatening. We tried to reason with them, to offer to leave immediately, but they weren't interested in letting us go so easily. The fear in our group was tangible, and I could see the panic starting to set in as we realized just how dangerous the situation had become. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, told us to stay put while they decided what to do with us. He made it clear that if we tried to run, things would get ugly. We had no choice but to comply. Sitting in silence as they huddled together, their voices low but their intent clear. The campfire, which had once been a source of warmth and comfort, now cast eerie, flickering shadows over the men's faces, making them look even more sinister. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. fear growing with each passing second. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I knew it was useless. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and in the middle of nowhere. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, one of the men suddenly turned and pointed his rifle at us. Cold smile on his face as he taunted us, daring us to make a move. It was in that moment that I knew we had to do something. One of my friends, who had been quiet up until then, slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight. He flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness and blinding the man with the rifle for just a moment. It was enough. We scrambled to our feet and ran, darting into the woods with the sound of gunshots ringing out behind us. The terror of that moment, of running for our lives through the dark, unknown wilderness, is something I'll never forget. We didn't stop running until we were sure we had lost them, our breath coming in ragged gasps as we collapsed in a small clearing. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the stars above, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. We were miles from anywhere, with no way to call for help, and no idea if the men were still searching for us. But we knew we couldn't stay where we were. We had to keep moving, find our way back to safety. Hours later, just as dawn was beginning to break, we stumbled upon a dirt road. Exhausted, shaken, and desperate, we followed it until we reached a small farmhouse. The owner, an older man who had clearly seen his share of trouble, took one look at us and didn't hesitate to offer help. He called the local authorities, who arrived not long after and listened to our story with grave expressions. They told us we were lucky to be alive, that the area we had been camping in was known for its dangerous locals who didn't take kindly to strangers. We were escorted back to town, our camping trip cut short by the harrowing events of the night. The memory of those armed men, their cold stares, and the terror of running through the dark woods has stayed with me ever since. I haven't been camping in Texas since, and I doubt I ever will again. The wilderness, once a place of peace and adventure, now holds a haunting reminder how quickly things can turn deadly. There's a certain allure to the solitude of a hunting trip, the way the world seems to shrink down to just you, the wilderness, and the prey you're tracking. I'd always enjoyed these solitary adventures, finding peace in the quiet of the woods and the focus that hunting demands. This particular trip was no different, or so I thought. I'd ventured deep into a remote forest, miles away from the nearest town, eager to spend a few days away from everything. But what started as a peaceful retreat quickly turned into a nightmare I barely escaped. First day went as planned. I set up camp near a small stream, the sound of the water providing a soothing backdrop as I prepared my gear. The forest was thick, towering trees, and dense underbrush, perfect setting for tracking game. I spent the day hiking through the woods, scanning for signs of deer and taking in the beauty, the untouched landscape. By the time the sun began to set, I hadn't had any luck. But I didn't mind. I was just happy to be out there, surrounded by nature. That night, as I sat by the campfire, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest, usually full of the sounds of nocturnal creatures, was unnervingly silent. Crackling of the fire seemed too loud in the stillness, and the darkness beyond the firelight felt oppressive, as if it were closing in on me. I tried to ignore the unease, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But when I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the distance, my heart skipped a beat. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they were getting closer. I stood up, grabbing my rifle and scanning the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the fire. I called out, hoping it was just another hunter, but there was no response. Footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I strained to listen, every muscle in my body tense. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. After what felt like an eternity, footsteps resumed, this time moving away from my camp. I didn't sleep much that night, my nerves on edge, my senses heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my heart racing. By morning, I was exhausted, but the forest seemed to have returned to normal. Birds singing in the trees, distant chatter of squirrels. I convinced myself that it had just been an animal, maybe a curious deer or a stray dog. The unease lingered. The next day, I ventured deeper into the woods, determined to make the most of the trip. I spent hours tracking a set of fresh deer prints, the thrill of the hunt pushing the previous night's events to the back of my mind. But as the sun began to set, I realized I had ventured farther than I'd intended. The forest was thicker here, the underbrush more tangled, and the sense of being watched returned with a vengeance. I decided to head back to camp. I paced quickening as the shadows lengthened. That's when I saw the cabin. It was small, tucked away in a clearing, and looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged in the middle. Something about it made me uneasy, but I was curious. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready, and peered through a gap in the boards. The interior was dark, but I could make out the shapes of old furniture covered in dust. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, but hadn't returned in a long time. As I turned to leave, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were right behind me. I spun around, my rifle aimed, but there was no one there. The forest was empty, the trees standing silent and still, but I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I could sense someone, or something, lurking just out of sight. Panic surged through me, and I started to back away, my eyes darting around, searching for the source of the footsteps. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. It was a man, but there was something wrong about him. His clothes were dirty and torn, his face gaunt and pale. He stood there, watching me with hollow eyes, and when our gazes met, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The man took a step forward, and that was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, sprinting through the forest as fast as I could, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him following me, his presence like a shadow clinging to me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I raced through the underbrush, desperate to reach the safety of my camp. When I finally burst into the clearing where I'd set up camp, I didn't stop. I grabbed my gear and packed up as quickly as I could, my hands shaking with fear. I could still feel his eyes on me, watching from the darkness. The forest that I had once found so peaceful now felt like a prison, and I knew I had to leave before it was too late. I slung my pack over my shoulder and headed back the way I had come, not stopping until I reached my car. The drive back to town was a blur, my mind racing with what had just happened. I couldn't shake the image of the man in the woods, his hollow eyes staring into mine. I didn't report the encounter. Who would believe me? But the experience left a deep scar, a chilling reminder that the wilderness, with all its beauty, can also hide dark and terrifying secrets. I haven't been on a solo hunting trip since, and I doubt I ever will again. Being a rideshare driver isn't always the most thrilling job, but it's a good way to make some extra cash, meet interesting people, and explore the city. Most nights are uneventful, just a series of pickups and drop-offs with the occasional chatty passenger. But one night, I picked up a fare that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about people, and made me wonder if I'd ever be able to trust a stranger again. It was a typical late night, the streets quiet, and the city lights casting an eerie glow on the empty roads. I got a ping for a pickup in a part of town that wasn't exactly known for its nightlife, but I didn't think much of it. The rider was a man, waiting on a dimly lit corner, pacing nervously as I approached. As soon as he got into the car, I could tell something was off. He was jittery, constantly looking over his shoulder and fidgeting in his seat. I tried to strike up a conversation to ease the tension, asking if he was having a rough night. His response was a low mutter, something about needing to get out of town, fast. That's when I noticed the small cuts and bruises on his hands, the way his eyes darted around like a cornered animal. Every instinct I had told me this was a bad situation, but I couldn't just kick him out of the car in the middle of nowhere. So I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. As we made our way out of the city, the man's paranoia grew. He kept asking me to take random turns, glancing back at the road behind us, as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. I could feel the tension in the car thickening with every mile, my own anxiety rising as I realized we were heading further and further away from any place I knew. The city lights faded into the distance, and the roads grew darker, more desolate. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked him directly what was going on, why he was so desperate to leave town. He hesitated for a moment, then blurted out something about being in trouble, about people who were after him. His voice was shaky, and there was a wild look in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. He kept repeating that he needed to get far away, that if they found him, it would be the end. The fear in his voice was real, and it was contagious. The longer we drove, the more erratic he became, directing me down increasingly remote roads, away from any signs of life. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't know if he was telling the truth or if he was just paranoid, but either way, I knew I needed to get out of this situation. Then, out of nowhere, he told me to stop the car. His voice was calm, too calm, and that's when I noticed he was clutching something in his jacket, something that looked suspiciously like a gun. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind screaming at me to stay calm. He ordered me to get out of the car, his voice low and threatening. I didn't argue. I unbuckled my seatbelt and slowly stepped out, my hands raised in surrender. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. He slid over into the driver's seat, his eyes never leaving mine as he started the car and sped off, leaving me standing alone in the middle of nowhere. As the taillights disappeared into the darkness, I felt a wave of relief mixed with fear. I was safe, but I had no idea where I was, or how long it would be before someone found me. My phone was in the car, along with all my belongings. I was completely alone, with nothing but the clothes on my back. I started walking, hoping to find a road or a house, anything that could lead me back to safety. Hours later, just as dawn was breaking, I finally stumbled upon a small farmhouse. The owner was kind enough to let me use the phone, and I called the police, explaining what had happened. They found the car abandoned a few miles away, my phone and wallet missing, but no sign of the man. I never found out who he was or what he was running from, and to this day, the memory of that night haunts me. The thought that I could have been just another victim in a horror story chills me to the bone. Being a rideshare driver means trusting strangers, but after that night, I found it hard to trust anyone. The job isn't worth the risk anymore, not after coming so close to something truly terrifying. I've moved on to other work, but I'll never forget that feeling of helplessness, standing alone in the dark, wondering if I'd make it out alive. The forest has always been my escape, a place where the world's worries seem to fade away, leaving only the rustling leaves and the scent of pine. So when I planned my solo backpacking trip into the heart of an untouched woodland, I was looking forward to days of peace, solitude, and reconnection with nature. The trail I chose was a remote one, far from the usual camping spot, winding through dense forests and across streams, leading to a secluded area few had explored. It was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The trail was challenging but beautiful, with towering trees and dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. I hiked for hours, stopping occasionally to admire the scenery or to take in the quiet, almost reverent atmosphere of the forest. As the sun began to set, I found a small clearing and set up camp, the serenity of the surroundings lulling me into a sense of calm. The night was peaceful, with only the distant hoot of an owl to remind me that I wasn't completely alone. The next morning, I packed up and continued my hike, eager to reach a hidden waterfall I'd read about in an old hiking guide. The trail grew narrower and less distinct as I went deeper into the forest, but I wasn't worried. I had my map and compass, and I'd always been good with directions. But as the day wore on, the forest seemed to grow denser, the trees closing in around me, and the trail became harder to follow. Eventually, I realized that I hadn't seen a trail marker in hours. Panic started to creep in as I stopped to get my bearings. I pulled out my map. The thick canopy made it difficult to match the landmarks on paper to the landscape around me. The forest, which had felt so welcoming before, now seemed labyrinthine and hostile, the shadows between the trees growing darker as the afternoon light began to fade. I told myself to stay calm, that I just needed to backtrack and find the last marker. But the more I retraced my steps, the more disoriented I became. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I came to the terrifying realization that I was lost. Trail was nowhere to be found, and every direction I turned seemed to lead deeper into the woods. I tried to stay calm, to think logically, but the forest was a maze, and I was trapped in its depths. I decided to set up camp and wait until morning, hoping that a fresh start would help me find my way. But as the night descended, forest took on a more sinister feel. Usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, were drowned out by an unsettling silence. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I built a fire, its flickering light offering little comfort as the darkness pressed in around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made my heart pound. I felt eyes on me, though I knew I was alone, or at least I hoped I was. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife, my ears straining for any sign of danger. In the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the darkness. It was close, too close, and it sent a wave of terror through me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the dense foliage. The growl came again, this time from a different direction, and I realized with horror that whatever it was circling me. Desperate, I threw more wood on the fire, hoping the flames would keep whatever was out there at bay. But the growling continued, moving around me, always just out of sight. I knew I couldn't stay there, couldn't wait for whatever was stalking me to make its move. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, I made a decision. I had to leave. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking with fear, and set off in what I hoped was the right direction. I walked for hours, my senses on high alert, every shadow seeming to hide some unseen threat. The growling had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, still being followed. The forest seemed endless, and I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop, couldn't risk being caught out there after dark again. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I heard it, the sound of running water. I followed the sound, my heart lifting as I emerged from the trees and found myself at the edge of a wide stream. Relief washed over me. I had found a landmark, something I could follow. I knew that streams often led to rivers, and rivers led to towns. I splashed water on my face, the cold shock helping to clear my mind, and began walking along the stream, praying it would lead me to safety. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a small cabin nestled by the stream, its chimney smoking gently. I couldn't believe my luck. The cabin's owner, an elderly man, greeted me with a mixture of surprise and concern, offering me food and a place to rest. As I recounted my ordeal, he listened quietly, nodding as if he understood. "You're lucky," he said finally. "This forest isn't kind to those who get lost." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I was just grateful to be safe. The next day, he guided me back to the main trail, and I made my way out of the forest, vowing never to return. The peace I had sought had turned into a nightmare, forest revealing a darker, more sinister side. The memory of that growl, the feeling of being hunted, has stayed with me ever since. Nature may be beautiful, but it's also wild and unforgiving, a lesson I learned all too well in the depths of that forest. I remember the day like it was yesterday. My dog, Max, and I decided to take a hike through the dense forest near our home. The air was crisp, kind that bites your nose and fills your lungs with the scent of pine and earth. Max was darting ahead, his tail wagging furiously as he chased after the rustling leaves. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect, as if the world itself was holding its breath. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the light began to dim, even though it was still early afternoon. The tall trees closed in around us, their shadows stretching long and eerie across the path. Max suddenly stopped in his tracks, his ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. I followed his gaze and saw a man standing just off the trail, dressed in what looked like a park ranger's uniform. Something was off. His clothes were too clean, too crisp, like they hadn't seen a day in the woods. The man waved at us, his smile a bit too wide, his eyes not quite matching the warmth of his gesture. "Afternoon," called out, his voice echoing unnaturally through the silent forest. Max's growl deepened, his hackles raised, and my own sense of unease began to grow. The man stepped closer, his movements too smooth, almost rehearsed, as if he were playing a part. "You must be lost," he said, though we were clearly on the trail. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, the kind you get when you know something isn't right. The man's gaze flicked to Max, and I could see a strange glint in his eyes, something that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Without thinking, I tightened my grip on Max's leash and took a step back. "We're fine, thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But the man didn't move, didn't say a word, just kept staring at us with that unsettling grin. Max suddenly lunged forward, barking furiously, and I almost lost my grip on the leash. The man's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. That was all I needed to hear. I turned on my heel and bolted, dragging Max with me as we sprinted back down the trail. My heart pounded in my chest, forest around us now feeling like it was closing in, each tree a silent witness to our flight. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, the sunlight pouring down like a lifeline. I glanced back, expecting to see the man following us. The trail behind us was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to process what had just happened. Max was still growling, his eyes fixed on the tree line, as if expecting the stranger to emerge at any moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just narrowly escaped something terrible. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, his smile twisting into something far more sinister. The memory of his voice, the way it had dropped to that icy whisper, echoed in my mind. Max seemed restless too, pacing by the door and letting out the occasional low growl. The house felt different, colder, as if the eerie presence from the forest had followed us home. Days passed, but the encounter haunted me. I couldn't shake the sense that the man wasn't a park ranger at all, that he had been something else entirely. I started avoiding the woods, sticking to the roads and open spaces where I could see everything around me. But no matter how far I went, memory of that day lingered, a chilling reminder that some places are better left unexplored. Weeks later, I heard a story from a neighbor about a strange man seen in the woods, always just out of sight, always watching. They said he wore a uniform, but no one knew where he came from or what he wanted. The description matched the man I had encountered, and it sent a fresh wave of fear through me. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a haunting memory, tainted by that brief but terrifying encounter. It was one of those quiet afternoons, kind where you can hear the clock ticking in the next room. I was working from home, tapping away on my laptop, when I suddenly heard a noise that made my blood run cold. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that I was supposed to be alone in the house. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, but curiosity and fear had me straining to listen for more. Footsteps paused, then resumed, this time accompanied by a faint creak of the floorboards. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming from the hallway, just outside my door. I strained my ears, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Then I saw it, a woman's hand, pale and slender, reaching around the edge of the doorframe. My stomach twisted in fear as the hand lingered there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, none of them comforting. Who was this woman? What did she want? Why hadn't I heard her come in? The hand slowly withdrew, and the footsteps resumed, fading away into the silence of the house. I didn't dare move. My eyes were locked on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the footsteps themselves. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, paralyzed by fear. When I finally mustered the courage to move, I reached for my phone with trembling hands, ready to call the police. Before I could dial, I heard the front door creak open, then close softly. The house was quiet again, eerily so. I listened intently, but there were no more footsteps, no more sounds of any kind. It was as if the intruder had simply vanished, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. Gathering every ounce of courage, I crept toward the door and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. The air felt cold, like a draft had swept through, though all the windows were shut tight. My heart pounded in my chest as I checked each room, half expecting to find the woman lurking in a corner. But there was no one. The house was empty, just as it had been before. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered, a chilling reminder of what had just occurred. I couldn't shake the eerie sensation. The woman had been looking for something, or someone. But what unnerved me the most was that she had left without taking anything. No valuables were missing, no signs of forced entry, just the haunting memory of that hand and the sound of those footsteps. I double-checked every lock, every window, making sure the house was secure. But no matter what I did, I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that something was wrong. That night, sleep was a distant thought. Every creak, every whisper of the wind outside had me on edge. I kept seeing that hand in my mind's eye, pale skin stark against the dark wood of the doorframe. Felt like a scene from a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. Even Max, usually a solid sleeper, was restless, his ears twitching at every sound. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a stranger's home, filled with unseen threats. Days passed, but the unease never left. I started noticing small things out of place. An open drawer here, a moved chair there. At first, I chalked it up to my nerves, but soon it became impossible to ignore. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, checking the locks multiple times a day. It was as if the intruder had left something behind, an invisible presence that refused to leave. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and left the house, staying with a friend for a few days. When I returned, the house seemed normal again, the unsettling atmosphere gone, but I knew I would never feel truly at ease there again. The memory of that day, of the hand and the footsteps, would always be with me, a haunting reminder that some things are better left unexplained. It was supposed to be a peaceful day of hiking with Max, my loyal companion, by my side. The mountain trail was quiet, with only the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air was cool, and the sky was a perfect shade of blue, the kind of day that makes you forget the world and just enjoy the moment. But as we ascended higher, something in the atmosphere changed. The light grew dimmer, and the temperature dropped, sending a shiver down my spine. We were deep into the hike when I first noticed him. A man emerged from the dense woods, stepping onto the trail a few yards ahead of us. He was dressed in an unusual suit, kind you'd expect to see at a funeral, not on a mountainside. It was old-fashioned, almost out of place, and it clung to him as though it was a second skin. Max, usually friendly with everyone, stopped dead in his tracks, his hackles raised, and let out a low, uneasy growl. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The man didn't acknowledge us at first, his gaze fixed on the path ahead as if lost in thought. But then, slowly, he turned his head to look at us. His eyes were dark, almost too dark, and there was an unsettling stillness about him, like he wasn't entirely there. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was more of a grimace, a show of teeth that made my blood run cold. "Beautiful day for a hike," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth or emotion. I forced a smile, my mind racing as I tried to assess the situation. Something about the man felt wrong, deeply wrong, as if he didn't belong in this world. Max pressed closer to me, his growls growing louder, more insistent. The man's gaze shifted to my dog, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. something predatory, something hungry. My instincts screamed at me to leave, get as far away from this man as possible. Yeah, it is, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as I took a step back. The man's smile widened, chilling expression that sent a jolt of fear through me. You shouldn't be out here alone, he said, echoing the words I'd heard once before. My heart raced, memories of that earlier encounter flashing through my mind. The forest, the stranger, the escape. Couldn't go through that again. Without a second thought, I turned and started walking back the way we came, pulling Max along with me. The man didn't move, but I could feel his eyes on us, watching, waiting. We walked faster, my heart pounding in my chest, the eerie silence of the mountain pressing in around us. Every step felt like it was taking forever, the trails stretching on endlessly before us. Kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following us, but the path remained empty. Still, the sense of dread lingered, growing stronger with every passing moment. It felt like we were being hunted, even though there was no one in sight. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the base of the mountain. I breathed a sigh of relief as the familiar sounds of the valley returned, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But the encounter left me shaken, my mind replaying the man's unsettling smile and those dark, lifeless eyes. Max seemed to sense my unease, sticking close to my side, his usually energetic demeanor subdued. The mountain, once a place of solace, had become a source of fear, a haunting memory etched into my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to appear again. The thought kept me awake, every creak and groan of the house amplifying my paranoia. I knew I wouldn't be able to return to that trail, not after what happened. The mountain, with its breathtaking views and serene beauty, now held a darkness I couldn't ignore. The next day, I decided to share my experience with a local hiking group, hoping they might have some explanation for what I had seen. But as I described the man and his strange suit, I noticed the uneasy glances exchanged between the members. One of the older hikers pulled me aside afterward and whispered, "You're not the first to see him, you know? People say he's been haunting these trails for years. Some say he's a ghost, others a lost soul searching for something. But whatever he is, you're lucky you got away." It all started with a simple favor. My neighbor, Mr. Caldwell, had asked if I could lend him an extension cord. He was a quiet, reclusive man, the kind who kept to himself and rarely ventured out, but I didn't think much of it. As I handed him the cord, I noticed a bizarre metal sculpture in his garage, twisted, jagged pieces of metal welded together in a way that made it look almost alive. "What are you working on?" I asked, more out of politeness than curiosity. His response was a cryptic smile and a shrug, as if to say it was better if I didn't know. Days passed, and the encounter with Mr. Caldwell slipped from my mind, until one night when I found myself at a local bar, unwinding after a long week. I was nursing my drink when a man I didn't recognize approached me, his demeanor unsettling from the start. He was too close, his eyes too sharp, and his questions too personal. "You live around here, don't you?" he asked, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, trying to brush him off, but he persisted, leaning in closer. Just as I was about to tell him to back off, Mr. Caldwell appeared out of nowhere. He stepped between us, his presence suddenly commanding, and placed a hand on the stranger's shoulder. "I think it's time for you to leave," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking between us before he finally relented, muttering something under his breath as he slunk away. I was stunned. Mr. Caldwell, the quiet neighbor who rarely spoke, had just stepped in to defend me from a creepy stranger. I thanked him, but he brushed it off as if it was nothing. "Just looking out for my neighbors," he said with that same cryptic smile. We didn't talk much after that, but I couldn't help feeling a strange sense of gratitude mixed with unease. Who was Mr. Caldwell really? And why had he been at the bar that night, just in time to intervene? Questions swirled in my mind, but I pushed them aside, chalking it up to coincidence. Still, something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. A few weeks later, I saw Mr. Caldwell again, this time in his garage, tinkering with that strange sculpture. It had grown larger, more complex, almost as if it had a life of its own. The metal twisted and curved in ways that defied logic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Mr. Caldwell caught me staring and waved me over. "Come take a closer look," he said, his voice casual, but there was an undertone that made my skin crawl. I declined, making some excuse about being late for an appointment, and hurried back to my house. That night, I had a hard time sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sculpture, its twisted form looming in my mind like a dark, haunting presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Caldwell was more than he appeared to be. There was something sinister about him and his bizarre creation. My thoughts spiraled, the lines between reality and imagination blurring, as I wondered if I was just being paranoid, or if there was something genuinely wrong with my neighbor. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It was from Mr. Caldwell, written in neat, precise handwriting. "Thank you for the extension cord. I've finished my project. If you're ever curious, feel free to stop by." The message was innocuous enough, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Couldn't bring myself to go over there, not after everything that had happened. The thought of that sculpture, of what it might represent, kept me away. As days turned into weeks, I saw less and less of Mr. Caldwell. His garage door remained closed, the eerie sculpture hidden from view. The memory of it lingered in my mind. I couldn't help but wonder what he had been working on, and why he had seemed so keen to show it to me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been right to trust my instinct. Some things are better left unseen, and some neighbors are better left alone. Eventually, Mr. Caldwell moved away, just as quietly as he had lived. His house sat empty for months, the yard overgrown and the windows dark. I heard rumors that he had taken his strange sculpture with him, that he was working on something even more bizarre in his new home. I never found out where he went. Part of me was relieved. The memory of those days, the favor and the bar and the sculpture, remains with me still, a chilling reminder of the unsettling truths sometimes lurk just next door. The Idaho wilderness had always been my escape, a place where I could disconnect from the world and find peace. That weekend, I had decided to camp alone, just me and the great outdoors. The day had been perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the sound of nature all around. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set up my tent and built a small fire, ready to enjoy a night under the stars. But as darkness fell, the woods around me took on an eerie stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It wasn't long before I heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. First, I thought it was just my imagination, product of too many late-night horror stories. Then it came again, closer this time, reverberating through the still night air. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see through the flickering firelight. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep and primal, sending a chill down my spine. Whatever it was big, and it was circling my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. But the beam only revealed shifting shadows and the rustle of leaves in the wind. The growling stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps, moving methodically around the perimeter of my camp. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized I was being stalked. The creature was out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Panic set in as I fumbled with my gear, trying to decide whether to stay put or make a run for it. Fire, once a source of comfort, now felt like a beacon, drawing the creature closer. I could hear its breathing now, heavy and ragged, just beyond the edge of the light. My hands shook as I grabbed my backpack, deciding that I couldn't stay there any longer. I doused the fire with dirt and quietly slipped out of the campsite, hoping to make my escape unnoticed. I barely made it 50 yards before I heard the creature again, this time much closer, its footsteps matching mine. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my ears as I tore through the underbrush. Branches clawed at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't dare slow down. The growling was relentless, following me through the forest like a dark, haunting shadow. I knew I had to get to the road, to the safety of my car, but it felt like the forest was conspiring to keep me trapped. Finally, I burst through the tree line and onto the gravel road where I had parked. My car was just ahead, and I sprinted toward it, praying that the creature wouldn't follow me out into the open. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys as I heard the growling one last time, this time from the edge of the woods. I didn't wait to see if it would come any closer. It jumped in, slammed the door shut, and tore down the road, my tires kicking up dust as I sped away. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature chasing after me. The road was empty, forest behind me dark and silent. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to process what had just happened. I had never been so terrified in my life. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, become a place of nightmares. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't an ordinary animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I finally pulled over and tried to catch my breath. The reality of what had happened slowly sank in, and I realized just how close I had come to something terrible. I had left all my gear behind, my tent, my supplies, everything. But I didn't care. Nothing was worth going back to that campsite, not after what I had experienced. The memory of that night, of the growling and the footsteps, will stay with me forever. A chilling reminder of the unknown terrors that lurk in the wild. In the days that followed, I heard stories from other campers and hikers, tales of strange creatures and unexplained phenomena in the Idaho wilderness. Some said it was just a bear, others spoke of something more sinister, a creature that defied description. Whatever it was, I knew I never wanted to encounter it again. My days of solo camping were over, and I vowed never to return to those woods. The forest had taken something from me that night, my sense of safety, my love for the wilderness, and left me with only fear in its place. I was visiting my girlfriend's family on the outskirts of a small city in Mexico. Place where the night seems to stretch on forever and the stars shine brighter than anywhere else. The house was charming, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city, surrounded by fields and dense patches of trees. It was my first time there, and I was eager to make a good impression. The days were filled with laughter and warmth, but as night fell, a strange unease began to settle over me, one that I couldn't quite shake. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself unable to sleep. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I lay there staring at the ceiling when I heard it, soft shuffling sound coming from outside the window. First I thought it was just the wind, then the sound grew louder, more deliberate. My curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly slipped out of bed to take a look. As I peeked through the curtains, my breath caught in my throat. Standing in the backyard, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure, tall, thin, and eerily still. The moonlight cast just enough light to see that it wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at the house. A wave of cold fear washed over me as I realized that it was watching, waiting. I quickly stepped back from the window, my heart racing in my chest. I debated waking my girlfriend or her family, but something held me back. What if they didn't see it? What if it was all in my head? But the fear was too real, too palpable, to ignore. I crept back to bed, pulling the covers over me as if they could somehow protect me from whatever was outside. The sound of the shuffling returned. Closer now, like it was circling the house. Every muscle in my body was tense, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the night dragged on in a terrifying silence, broken only by that haunting sound. Morning came, and with it, a false sense of relief. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the events of the previous night felt like a distant nightmare. I decided not to mention anything to my girlfriend, not wanting to worry her. But the memory of that figure, of those unnaturally long limbs and that eerie stillness stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it hadn't left. It was still out there, lurking, waiting for night to fall again. The next night, sleep eluded me once more. The house was quiet, everyone else fast asleep, but I couldn't relax. My ears were tuned to every creak, every rustle outside. Then, just as I feared, the shuffling began again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I stayed in bed, too terrified to move, my mind racing with possibilities. What was this thing? Why was it here? And what did it want with us? The questions spun in my head, but there were no answers, only that chilling sound growing closer and closer. I forced myself to peek out the window again, hoping, praying that it had gone. But it hadn't. The figure was there, closer than before. Its face, if it could be called that, turned toward my window. I couldn't make out any features, just a blank, smooth surface where a face should have been. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward the house. Panic surged through me, but I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrifying sight. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, figure stopped, tilted its head slightly, as if listening for something, and slowly backed away, disappearing into the shadows. The shuffling sound faded, leaving me in a terrifying silence once more. I didn't sleep at all that night, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What had I just witnessed? Was it real, or some figment of my imagination? But deep down, I knew it was real. Too real. The next morning, I decided to tell my girlfriend's family. They listened intently, their expressions growing more serious as I described what I had seen. Her grandmother crossed herself, muttering something under her breath in Spanish. They told me stories of strange sightings in the area. Figures seen in the fields at night, always watching, never approaching. Some said they were spirits, others believed them to be something far worse, something that defied explanation. Whatever it was, they urged me to be cautious, respect whatever it was that roamed the outskirts at night. I didn't need any more convincing. That night, I stayed inside, refusing to even glance out the window. The shuffling returned, but I kept my eyes shut tight, praying for morning to come. The fear I felt in those moments was unlike anything I had ever experienced. A deep, primal terror that still haunts me to this day. The Mexican outskirts, once a place of warmth and family, had become a place of nightmares, leaving me with a chilling reminder of the unknown horrors that lurk just beyond the edge of the light. I've always loved the solitude of the backwoods, where the only sounds are the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. That's why I looked forward to my annual hunting trip deep in the forest, far from civilization. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil as I made my way to my usual spot. But this year something felt different. There was a stillness in the air, a strange silence that hung over the woods like a thick fog. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my imagination, and set up my camp for the night. As darkness fell, the quiet grew even more oppressive. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, frogs, the rustle of nocturnal creatures were conspicuously absent. My fire crackled softly, the only source of light in the encroaching darkness. I sat by the flames, rifle by my side, trying to enjoy the solitude that had always brought me peace. But there was an unease gnawing at the back of my mind. Feeling that I wasn't alone, I tried to shake it off, but the sensation only grew stronger as the night wore on. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to see beyond the firelight, but the shadows were thick, concealing whatever lurked beyond. Growl came again, closer this time, sending a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my rifle, the cold metal a comforting weight in my hands. But the fear gnawing at my gut told me that this was no ordinary animal. There was something in those woods with me, something that didn't belong. I stood up, scanning the darkness, my senses on high alert. The fire suddenly seemed too small, too weak to keep whatever it was at bay. I could hear it moving now, heavy footsteps crunching on the forest floor, circling my camp. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to pinpoint its location, but it was too quick, too elusive. The growls grew louder, more insistent, filling the night air with a menacing presence. I knew I had to do something. What? Running seemed foolish, but staying felt like a death sentence. Just when I thought the terror couldn't get any worse, I saw it. Pair of glowing eyes reflecting the firelight, staring at me from the shadows. They were too high off the ground to belong to any known animal, and there was an intelligence in them that sent a chill down my spine. I aimed my rifle, hands trembling. The creature moved too fast, darting through the trees with unnatural speed. It was toying with me, letting me know it was there, watching, waiting. I knew then that I was being hunted. Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I fired into the darkness. The gunshot echoed through the silent woods, a sharp crack that seemed to cut through the tension. The creature didn't retreat. Instead, it growled louder, more aggressive, as if the shot had only angered it. I backed away from the fire, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, but the way back to my truck was long and treacherous in the dark. The creature's growls echoed in the night, reminding me that it was always just a step behind. I made a snap decision and bolted from the camp, rifle clutched tightly in my hands. The darkness swallowed me up, the trees blurring together as I ran, every instinct screaming at me to keep moving. I could hear the creature following, its footsteps heavy and relentless, gaining on me with every stride. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, desperate to reach the safety of my truck. Forest around me was a blur, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of doom. Just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst into the clearing where my truck was parked. Fumbled with the keys, adrenaline making my hands shake, and finally managed to get the door open. I threw myself inside, locking the doors just as I heard the creature emerge from the woods. I didn't wait to see what it was. I started the engine and floored it, tires kicking up dirt as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark, moving back into the trees, its eyes glowing eerily in the headlights before disappearing into the night. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the forest, my heart still pounding in my chest. The safety of civilization brought no comfort, though. The memory of those eyes, that growl, and the relentless pursuit haunted me. Chilling reminder that there are things in this world we're not meant to understand. I never went back to those woods. Backwoods, once my haven, become a place of nightmares, leaving me with only fear and unanswered questions. When I first moved to Australia, I was struck by the tranquility of my new home. It was nestled in a quiet neighborhood, with rolling hills in the distance that caught the first light of dawn. Each morning, just as the sun peeked over the horizon, I heard it. A violin, playing the most haunting melody I'd ever heard. At first, I thought it was a dream. The soft strains of the violin so delicate and eerie that they seemed to drift into my consciousness from another world. But as the days passed, the music became a regular part of my mornings, always starting at the same time, always playing the same sorrowful tune. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started looking for the source of the music. It seemed to be coming from the hill behind my house, a place shrouded in mist every morning. The sound was clear yet distant, as if the violinist was both near and far away at the same time. I couldn't help but feel drawn to it, the melody pulling at something deep within me, something I couldn't quite name. There was a sadness in the music, a longing that made my chest tighten with each note. One morning, I decided to follow the sound. I grabbed my jacket and ventured out into the chilly morning air, my breath puffing out in white clouds as I made my way toward the hill. The closer I got, the more intense the music became, each note resonating through the mist, a call from the past. As I climbed the hill, the fog grew thicker, wrapping around me like a shroud. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The music guided me, a beacon in the eerie silence. Finally, I reached the top of the hill, and there, standing at the edge of a cliff, was a figure. The mist swirled around them, obscuring their features, but I could see the outline of a violin held gracefully in their hands. The music filled the air, so haunting and beautiful that it took my breath away. I wanted to call out, to ask who they were, but something held me back. There was an otherworldly quality to the scene, as if I had stepped into a dream. The figure seemed to be a part of the mist, ethereal and fleeting. I watched in silence, entranced by the music, until the final note hung in the air, echoing in the stillness. The figure lowered the violin and turned to face me. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The mist parted slightly. I caught a glimpse of their face, pale, almost translucent, with eyes that held the weight of centuries. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that this was no ordinary musician. There was something ancient, something hauntingly familiar about them, as if I had known them in another life. Before I could say anything, the figure vanished, dissolving into the mist like a wisp of smoke. The sudden silence was deafening, the absence of the music leaving a void that felt almost unbearable. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Had it been real, or just a figment of my imagination? The chill in the air, the eerie silence, and the haunting melody that still echoed in my mind told me that it had been very real. I returned home, shaken and unable to shake the feeling that something significant had happened on that hill. The next morning, I waited for the music, but it never came. The silence was unsettling, a stark contrast to the melody that had greeted me every day since I moved in. I started asking around the neighborhood, hoping someone could shed light on the mysterious violinist, but no one seemed to know anything about it. They all looked at me as if I were imagining things, but I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. Weeks passed, and the music never returned. The hill, once a place of mystery and allure, now seemed foreboding, as if it held secrets that were best left undisturbed. I avoided it, but the memory of that morning stayed with me, the haunting melody playing in my mind whenever I found myself alone. It was as if the violinist had left a piece of themselves with me. Reminder of something lost and forgotten. The feeling of sadness, of longing, lingered, making me question what I had truly encountered. One day, as I was cleaning out the attic, I found an old photograph tucked away in a dusty box. It was faded, but I recognized the hill immediately. Standing on the edge of the cliff was the same figure I had seen, the violin poised in their hands. My heart raced as I turned the photo over, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw the date, 1901. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The violinist was long dead, and yet I had seen them with my own eyes. The photo confirmed what I had feared. The figure on the hill was a ghost, playing a haunting melody that would forever echo in my mind. After that eerie morning on the hill, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a strange dream. But the unease lingered, settling into my bones like a chill that wouldn't go away. The violin's haunting melody played in my mind at odd moments, pulling me back to that misty hilltop. Then, as if the music had unlocked something in the air, the strange occurrences began. Started with small things. Tools left out in the yard, despite me being certain I'd put them away, and the occasional unexplained footprint in the damp earth outside my window. First, I brushed it off as forgetfulness. The incidents grew more frequent, more unsettling. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of something tapping against my window. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, straining to hear it again. The room was dark, only light coming from the sliver of the moon that peeked through the curtains. I waited, every muscle tense, but the sound didn't come again. In the morning, I found faint smudges on the glass, as if someone or something had been pressing against it. The feeling of being watched became a constant presence in my life. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. At night, I would hear faint noises, whispers, creaks, sound of footsteps echoing through the house. I would search every corner, every closet, but I never found anyone. The unease grew into fear, a gnawing dread that made it hard to sleep, hard to relax. My once peaceful home had become a place of anxiety, a place where the normalcy of everyday life was slowly unraveling. One evening as I was locking up for the night, I noticed something on the porch that made my blood run cold. There on the welcome mat was a single violin string, coiled like a snake. It was old, frayed at the ends, and it sent a chill down my spine. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and examined it closely. It was the same kind of string I had seen on the violin that morning on the hill. The connection was undeniable. and it filled me with a sense of dread. Was the violinist trying to reach out to me, or was this a warning? Things escalated after that. Late one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. I bolted upright, my heart racing, and grabbed the nearest object, a heavy flashlight, before creeping down the hall. The kitchen was dark, and the crash had sent plates and cups scattering across the floor. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but as I scanned the room, I saw nothing out of place except the broken dishes. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A single, wet footprint leading away from the sink, disappearing into the darkness. The final straw came a few nights later. I was sitting in the living room, trying to calm my nerves with a book, when I felt it. Cold breeze that swept through the room, despite all the windows being shut tight. I looked up, and there, standing just outside the window, was the figure from the hill. They were staring directly at me, their face obscured by the mist that seemed to cling to them like a second skin. The violin was in their hands, but this time, they didn't play. They just stood there, watching me with those empty eyes. Didn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure raised the violin slowly, as if to play, but then stopped, lowering it again. Their gaze never left mine, and I felt a chill spread through my body, freezing me in place. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The silence that followed was oppressive, suffocating, and I knew in that moment that I couldn't stay in this house any longer. Whatever was happening, it was beyond my understanding, and it was far too chilling to face alone. The next morning, I packed a bag and left, leaving the house behind. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Violin, the strange encounters, the figure at the window. It's all too much. As I drove away, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the figure standing on the porch, watching me leave. The house was empty, silent, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was still following me. The fear stayed with me, a haunting reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The Appalachian Trail had always been a place of solitude and reflection for me, a stretch of wilderness where I could escape the demands of daily life. This time, I wasn't alone. I was hiking with two friends, Max and Sarah, both seasoned hikers who shared my love for the outdoors. We set up camp near a quiet bend in the trail, trees towering above us like ancient guardians. The evening was calm, the fire crackling merrily as we shared stories and laughed about the day's hike. But as night fell, the atmosphere shifted, taking on a strange, eerie quality that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It started with the sounds, distant at first, almost imperceptible, growing louder as the darkness deepened. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and the faint sound of footsteps in the underbrush. We paused, listening intently, but saw nothing in the flickering firelight. "Probably just animals," Max said, trying to brush it off. Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances. There was something off about the sounds, something too deliberate, too human. As the night wore on, the noises grew more unsettling. We could hear them circling our camp, moving closer and then retreating, as if testing the boundaries. The fire, once comforting, now seemed too small, too fragile to keep the darkness at bay. We huddled closer, our conversation dying off as the tension grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something, or someone, was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. Then we saw them, figures moving through the trees, their outlines barely visible in the darkness. They carried lanterns, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the ground. At first, we thought they might be other hikers, but something about their movements was wrong. They were too slow, too deliberate, like they were searching for something. My heart raced as I watched them, cold sweat breaking out on my skin. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, voice trembling with fear. We quickly packed up our gear, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The figures continued to move through the trees, their lanterns swinging in slow arcs, casting chilling light on their surrounding. The closer they got, the more I could see. Tattered clothes, faces obscured by the darkness. but there was an undeniable malevolence in the air. It felt like we were intruding on something we weren't supposed to see, something ancient and forgotten. The urge to flee was overwhelming, but we moved cautiously, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves. Just as we were about to leave, one of the figures stopped, turning its lantern toward our camp. The light swept across the trees, landing on us for a brief, terrifying moment. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears as the figure stared at us. Then, without warning, it let out a chilling scream, a sound so unnatural and eerie that it sent us into a panic. We grabbed our packs and ran, the scream echoing in the night as the other figures turned their lanterns toward us, their footsteps quickening as they pursued. We bolted down the trail, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we ran through the darkness. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but we didn't dare slow down. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees becoming a blur as we raced through the underbrush. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who were those figures? What were they doing out here? And why did they seem so intent on following us? The questions tumbled through my head, but there was no time to think, only to run. Finally, we reached a clearing, the moonlight spilling down onto the trail. We paused to catch our breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. The forest was silent now, the only sound our labored breathing. But the fear lingered, a chilling reminder of what we had just experienced. We didn't speak, didn't need to. The terror in our eyes said it all. We had to keep moving, to put as much distance between us and those figures as possible. We didn't stop until we reached a shelter several miles down the trail. Exhausted and shaken, we huddled together, trying to make sense of what had happened. None of us had an explanation, but we all knew one thing for certain. We weren't going back to that campsite. The Appalachian Trail, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a place of nightmares, haunted by those figures with their lanterns and their chilling screams. We left the next morning, the experience seared into our minds, a haunting reminder of the unknown dangers that lurk in the wilderness. My family and I were looking forward to a peaceful getaway, something to break the monotony of our daily routine. We found a quaint bed and breakfast tucked away in the countryside, run by an elderly couple who seemed friendly enough. The place was charming, with its old-world decor and the smell of fresh bread wafting through the halls. We checked in, feeling at ease in the cozy environment. The first night passed uneventfully, with only the distant hoot of an owl breaking the silence. But by the second night, things began to take a chilling turn. It started innocently enough. Mr. Thompson, the host, knocked on our door to ask if we needed anything. It was a bit late, but I figured he was just being hospitable. I assured him we were fine, and he nodded, but I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on the door before he left. It was a small thing, easily brushed off, but it left me with a strange feeling, like there was something he wasn't telling us. I shrugged it off, determined to enjoy the rest of our stay. Later that night, as we were settling into bed, there was another knock on the door. This time it was Mrs. Thompson, asking if we were comfortable. Her tone was friendly, but there was an underlying tension that I couldn't quite place. Again, I assured her we were fine, but the frequency of these check-ins was beginning to unsettle me. It felt as though they were trying to keep tabs on us. But why? My wife noticed it too, and we exchanged worried glances after the door closed. The real trouble started in the early hours of the morning. We were woken by the sound of creaking floorboards, footsteps slowly making their way down the hall. At first, I thought it was just another guest, but then the footsteps stopped right outside our door. My heart raced as I listened. Waiting for a knock never came. Instead, the footsteps resumed, this time circling our room, stopping intermittently as if someone was listening for something. My wife and I lay there, frozen in fear, too terrified to move or speak. The next day, I tried to brush it off as nerves, maybe an overactive imagination. But as the day wore on, the unsettling atmosphere only grew stronger. The Thompsons were polite, but there was a nervousness about them, as if they were hiding something. Every time we left our room, they were there, hovering nearby, watching us with those unsettling smiles. Felt like we were being monitored, like our every move was being scrutinized. The cozy charm of the bed and breakfast had vanished, replaced by a sense of dread that we couldn't shake. That evening, as we prepared for bed, I made sure to lock the door, hoping it would give us some sense of security. Deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. We were both on edge, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Just as we were about to turn off the lights, there was a soft tapping at the window. My wife gasped, and I turned to see a figure standing just outside, peering in at us. It was Mr. Thompson, his face partially obscured by the shadows, his expression blank and eerie. Panic surged through me as I rushed to the window, but by the time I got there, he was gone, vanished into the night. I pulled the curtains shut, my hands trembling. My wife and I were both terrified, the reality of our situation sinking in. Something was very wrong at this bed and breakfast, and we needed to leave. But with the night pressing in around us, the idea of venturing out into the darkness was just as terrifying as staying put. We were trapped, caught between two equally frightening choices. We didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold a new threat. The footsteps returned, pacing up and down the hall, stopping occasionally at our door. We held our breath, praying they would pass by. The sense of dread was overwhelming. The house, once so warm and inviting, now felt like a prison, with its creaking walls and the eerie silence that seemed to seep through every crack. We knew we had to leave, but we were paralyzed by fear, unsure of what lay outside our door. At the first light of dawn, we gathered our things and made a hasty exit. Thompsons were nowhere to be seen, and for that, I was grateful. As we drove away, the bed and breakfast faded into the distance, its once charming facade now a haunting memory. We didn't speak much on the way home, both of us too shaken to put our experience into words. But the fear stayed with us, a chilling reminder that some places, no matter how inviting, are best left alone. It was late, and I was driving along an old highway that cut through miles of barren landscape. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the road bathed in an inky darkness that my headlights barely pierced. There was something eerie about the emptiness around me. No other cars, no signs of life, just the long stretch of asphalt disappearing into the night. I'd been driving for hours, and fatigue was setting in when, without warning, my car sputtered and jerked, the engine cutting out with a final ominous cough. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder, cursing under my breath as I tried to restart the engine. Nothing. The car was dead, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. A wave of unease washed over me as I realized how isolated I was. There were no streetlights, no houses in sight, just the endless road and the dark, empty landscape. I felt a chill creep up my spine, kind that comes when you suddenly feel very small and very alone. I sat there for a while, debating my next move, and I saw headlights approaching in the distance. Relief flooded through me at the sight of another car, but it was short-lived. The vehicle slowed as it neared, an old battered pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days. Something about the way it crept toward me set off alarm bells in my head. The truck came to a stop just behind my car, and a man got out, his silhouette framed by the headlight. He approached slowly, his steps deliberate, and every instinct in me screamed to stay in the car. But before I could react, he was at my window, tapping on the glass. I forced a smile and rolled it down just enough to talk. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice gruff and unsettling. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what happened. He offered to take a look, but there was something in his eyes, coldness that made my skin crawl. "I'm fine," I said quickly, just waiting for a tow truck. It was a lie, worse, but I didn't care. I just wanted him to leave. He didn't move, though, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "Not many folks come down this road at night," he said, his tone almost accusatory. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how vulnerable I was. No one knew I was here, and the highway was deserted. If anything happened, there would be no one to help. Man finally stepped back. The unease didn't leave me. I watched as he walked back to his truck, half expecting him to drive away. Instead, he just sat there, headlights still illuminating my car. Minutes passed, each one dragging on longer than the last. I didn't dare make a move, too afraid of what might happen if I tried to leave. The man didn't approach again, but the fact that he was just sitting there, watching, was enough to keep my heart racing. I glanced at my phone again. Still no signal. Panic started to set in, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man had stepped out of his truck again, this time holding something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but the way he held it sent a jolt of fear through me. I knew I had to get out of there. My car was dead, and I was out of option. Just as I was about to make a desperate attempt to flee on foot, I saw another set of headlights approaching. This time, it was a tow truck. Relief washed over me like a wave as the truck pulled up, its lights cutting through the darkness. The driver, a burly man with a friendly smile, hopped out and waved. "Need some help?" called out. The man from the pickup truck hesitated, then slowly got back into his vehicle. He gave me one last look, a chilling stare that sent shivers down my spine, before he sped off into the night. I watched him go, my hands still shaking as the tow truck driver approached. "You're lucky I came by when I did," he said, oblivious to the terror that had gripped me moments before. I nodded, too shaken to speak, as he hooked up my car and offered to take me to the nearest town. As we drove away, I glanced back at the empty highway, still reeling from the encounter. The relief I felt was tempered by the realization of how close I had come to something terrible. The darkness, isolation, the cold stare of the man in the truck, it all felt like a nightmare, one that could have ended very differently. The abandoned highway, once just a stretch of road, had become a place of fear, a haunting reminder that danger can find you when you least expect it. It was supposed to be a routine walk through the forest, just me and my dog Bella. We'd done it countless times before, taking the familiar path that wound through the trees, the sunlight filtering down in golden patches. The forest was usually a place of peace for me, a sanctuary where I could clear my mind. But that day, something felt off from the start. The birds were quieter than usual, and there was a strange stillness in the air that I couldn't quite place. Bella seemed uneasy too, her ears twitching at every little sound. We hadn't gone far when Bella suddenly stopped, her body tense, staring intently at something in the distance. I followed her gaze, but at first I didn't see anything. Then a movement caught my eye, a figure stepping out from behind a tree. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was a man, shirtless and covered in dirt, his eyes wild and unfocused. In his hand he held a large machete, the blade glinting ominously in the dappled sunlight. The sight of him sent a chill down my spine, a sense of danger that was impossible to ignore. The man didn't say anything, just stood there watching us with a look that made my blood run cold. Bella growled low in her throat, her hackles raised, and I could feel the panic rising in me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. The path behind us was clear, but I knew we couldn't just turn our backs on him. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I also knew that running might provoke him. The air was thick with tension, and I felt trapped, caught between fear and the need to protect my dog and myself. Slowly, I started to back away, keeping my eyes on the man. Bella stayed close, her growls growing louder as the man took a step toward us. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve on high alert. "It's okay," I whispered to Bella, trying to keep my voice calm, though I was anything but. The man's gaze never wavered, his expression unreadable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was sizing us up, deciding what to do next. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the silence broken only by the distant rustle of leaves. Then, without warning, the man lunged forward, the machete slicing through the air. Bella barked furiously, and I turned and ran, pulling her with me as we tore down the path. The world blurred around me, my only focus on getting away, on putting as much distance between us and that man as possible. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind us, his footsteps heavy and relentless. Fear drove me forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself to run faster. get to safety. The forest, once familiar and comforting, had become a nightmare, the trees closing in around us as we fled. My mind raced with thoughts of what could happen if he caught us, the terror propelling me forward. Bella was right beside me, her barks turning to whines of fear as we sprinted through the forest. I didn't dare look back, too afraid of what I might see. The only thought in my head was to keep running, to get away, to survive. Finally, we broke through the tree line, the sight of the parking lot and my car a beacon of hope. I didn't stop until we reached the car, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands. I glanced back just once and saw the man standing at the edge of the forest, watching us with those same wild eyes. He didn't follow us out, just stood there, the machete hanging limply at his side. The sight of him, still and silent, was almost more terrifying than when he had chased us. Felt like he was letting us go, but the reason why was lost on me. I jumped into the car, Bella leaping in beside me, and we sped away, the forest disappearing in the rearview mirror. My heart was still racing, my mind trying to process what had just happened. Peaceful walk we'd started with turned into a nightmare, one that I knew would haunt me for a long time. The image of the man with the machete, his wild eyes, and the way he had watched us stayed with me, a chilling reminder that danger can come from the most unexpected places. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the fear. Forest, once my refuge, was now a place of terror. I found myself avoiding it, sticking to open spaces where I could see everything around me. The memory of that day, of the man and his machete, lingered in my mind, a haunting presence that refused to fade. I didn't report it, partly out of fear, and partly because I knew that man was still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker to cross his path. I'll never forget that summer in Nebraska, the one that changed everything. I was babysitting the Johnson kids, Tommy and Lisa, at their farmhouse while their parents were out of town. The day had been hot and muggy, the kind of day that makes the air feel thick and heavy. The sky had been clear, but by late afternoon, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. There was something eerie about the way they moved, churning and boiling like a pot ready to overflow. I'd seen storms before, but this one felt different, more sinister. We were playing in the living room when the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending shivers down my spine. The sky outside had turned a sickly green, the kind of color that sends a chill down your spine. The weather reports had been talking about the possibility of tornadoes, but I hadn't taken it seriously. Now I wasn't so sure. The air was charged with electricity, and the sense of impending doom was palpable. I turned on the radio, hoping for an update, and that's when I heard it. Unmistakable wail of the tornado siren. Panic surged through me as I grabbed Tommy and Lisa, ushering them down to the basement as fast as I could. The wind outside had become a deafening roar, like a freight train barreling toward us. The house shook, the lights flickering as we huddled together in the darkness. I could hear the kids crying, their little bodies trembling with fear, and I held them close, trying to keep them calm. But inside, I was just as scared, my mind racing with thoughts of what was happening above us. The tornado hit with a force I'd never imagined. The sound was indescribable, a howling, screeching noise that drowned out everything else. I could feel the pressure in the room change, my ears popping as the air was sucked out of the basement. The walls shook violently. For a moment, I thought the house was going to collapse on top of us. We were trapped in a cocoon of terror, helpless as the storm raged outside. I prayed for it to end, for us to survive. The fear was overwhelming, chilling realization that we might not make it through. After what felt like an eternity, the noise began to subside. The wind died down, the house stopped shaking, and an eerie silence settled over us. I didn't dare move at first, too afraid of what I might find when I opened the door. But the kids were still crying, and I knew I had to be strong for them. I slowly made my way up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and pushed open the basement door. What I saw took my breath away. The house was still standing, but just barely. The windows were shattered, debris littered every surface, and the roof was partially gone, leaving the sky visible from where I stood. As I stepped outside, the full extent of the devastation hit me. The Johnsons' farm was a wreck, trees uprooted, barns flattened, and pieces of their lives scattered across the fields. But what haunted me the most was the silence. No birds, no crickets, nothing. It was as if the world had been sucked dry of life, leaving only a haunting emptiness in its wake. I looked around, trying to process the destruction, when I noticed something strange. Paper airplane, perfectly folded, sitting in the middle of the yard. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. It was just a piece of notebook paper, but there was something chilling about it, something that didn't belong in the midst of all this chaos. As I held it, a memory surfaced. One of the neighbors, the Harpers, who lived a few miles down the road. Their son, Jimmy, used to make paper airplanes all the time, sending them sailing across the fields. But Jimmy and his family hadn't made it through the storm. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Paper airplane had somehow survived, carried here by the tornado that had taken everything else away. In the days that followed, the community came together to rebuild, but the loss was immense. The Johnsons were lucky. Their home, though damaged, was still standing. The Harpers' place was gone, wiped off the map as if it had never existed. Paper airplane became a symbol of that day, a reminder of the lives lost and the fragility of everything we hold dear. I kept it, tucked away in a drawer, a haunting memento of that summer and the tragedy that had forever changed our lives. Even now, years later, the memory of that tornado and the eerie silence that followed lingers in my mind. The paper airplane is still with me, a small, seemingly insignificant object that carries with it the weight of that day. Every time I see it, I'm reminded of the storm, the fear, and of the lives that were lost. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly everything can be taken away, and of the strange, inexplicable things that sometimes survive when everything else is gone. It started innocently enough. A friendly wave from my neighbor across the street whenever I left for work, a casual greeting when we passed each other on the sidewalk. Mr. Walters seemed like a decent guy, the kind who kept to himself, but was always ready with a smile. I never thought much of him beyond that, just another person in the neighborhood. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice little things that didn't sit right, small oddities that gnawed at the back of my mind. It wasn't until I stumbled upon the truth that I realized just how chillingly wrong I had been. One evening, I was heading out to run some errands when I saw Mr. Walters standing on his porch, staring intently at my house. It was unusual, but I brushed it off, thinking he was just daydreaming. But when I returned, he was still there, his gaze fixed on my front door. A knot of unease formed in my stomach as I quickly went inside, locking the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that there was more to his stare than mere curiosity. The following week, I noticed it again. Mr. Walters watching my house from his window. This time, his expression was different, more focused, almost calculating. It unnerved me, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then, one morning, as I was leaving for work, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small camera hidden in the bushes near my front door. My heart raced as I realized that someone had been watching me, recording my every move. I confronted Mr. Walters about it later that day, but he denied knowing anything, his smile never wavering. His calm demeanor only fueled my suspicion, and I knew I couldn't let it go. I reported the incident to the police, who came by to investigate. They searched the area and found more cameras, all strategically placed around my property. It was a chilling discovery, one that left me feeling violated and exposed. But what they found next was even more disturbing. The police decided to search Mr. Walters' apartment, and what they uncovered was nothing short of horrifying. His walls were covered in photos of dozens, maybe hundreds, all taken without my knowledge. There were pictures of me leaving for work, that sitting on my porch, even through the windows of my home. The invasion of privacy was so complete, so thorough, that it left me reeling. I couldn't comprehend how someone I barely knew could have become so obsessed, so fixated on me. As the police continued their investigation, they discovered more unsettling details. Mr. Walters had kept meticulous notes about my daily routine, recording everything from the time I left the house to the groceries I bought. It was as if he had been studying me, learning my habits, preparing for something. The thought of it sent a chill down my spine, a haunting realization that I had been living under surveillance without even knowing it. But the most chilling discovery came when they searched his apartment further. They found a hidden room, one filled with old, rusted nails embedded in the walls. Each nail hole corresponded to a photograph, as if he had been pinning my life up on display, piece by piece. The sight of it was enough to make my skin crawl, the sense of violation overwhelming. The police assured me that Mr. Walters would be taken into custody, but the damage had already been done. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window, set my nerves on edge. The sense of security I once had in my home was shattered, replaced by a constant fear. Someone was still out there, watching, waiting. Photos, the cameras, the notes, was all too much. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer, not after what I had discovered. I moved away, trying to leave the nightmare behind. The memory of it lingered. The feeling of being watched, of having my privacy stripped away, was something I couldn't escape. The fear followed me, a chilling reminder of how vulnerable we can be, even in the safety of our own homes. Mr. Walters was gone, but the sense of violation remained, a haunting presence that would never truly leave. Even now, as I settle into a new life in a new place, I find myself looking over my shoulder, checking the windows, making sure no one is watching. The experience changed me, made me more cautious, more guarded. The world isn't as safe as I once believed, and trust is a fragile thing, easily shattered. The invasion of privacy was more than just a crime. It was a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary of places, a darkness that still haunts me to this day.